Good morning. Welcome to the February 2020 open meeting of the Federal Communications Commission. Acting Madam Secretary, could you please walk us through the agenda for the morning?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning to you and good morning, Commissioners. For today's meeting, you will hear 7 items for your consideration. First, you will consider a report and order and proposed order of modification that would reform the use of 3.7 to 4.2 gigahertz band, also known as the C-band, to promote U.S. leadership in the next generation of wireless services, including 5th generation wireless and other advanced spectrum-based services, and close the digital divide. Second, you will consider a public notice that would seek comment on procedures for the auction of new flexible use overlay licenses in the 3.7 to 3.98 gigahertz band, Auction 107, for next generation wireless services. Third, you will consider a public notice that would establish application and bidding procedures for Auction 105, the auction of priority access licenses in the Citizens Broadband Radio Service in the 3550 to 3650 megahertz band. Fourth, you will consider a notice of proposed rulemaking that would propose targeted changes to the white space device rules in the TV bands, channels 2 through 35, to provide improved broadband coverage that would benefit American consumers in rural and underserved areas. Fifth, you will consider a public notice that would launch the process of establishing pre- and post-auction application procedures and competitive bidding procedures to allocate up to $16 billion of support to the deployment of fixed broadband networks in rural America in Phase 1 of the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund. Sixth, you will consider a notice of proposed rulemaking that would seek comment on whether to eliminate or modify the requirement in the FCC's rules that cable operators maintain records in their online public inspection files regarding the nature and extent of their attributable interests in video programming services. Seventh, you will consider a second further notice of proposed rulemaking that would seek comment on providing state and federal agencies with read-only access to communications outage data for public safety purposes while also preserving the confidentiality of the data. This is your agenda for today. Please note that the item listed as 6th on the February 21st, 2020 Sunshine Notice has been adopted by the Commission and deleted from today's agenda. The first 2 items will be presented jointly by the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau and Office of Economics and Analytics. Donald Stockdale, Chief of the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, will introduce item 1, entitled Expanding Flexible Use of Economics and Analytics. Donald Stockdale, the Chief of the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, will introduce the items.
Thank you, Madam Secretary, and apologies to all. I've got a bit of a cold, which is why the rasp is exhibiting itself. But Mr. Stockdale, with that, please proceed.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. I am pleased to present to you the 3.7 gigahertz band report and order of proposed modification and the Auction 107 comment public notice. I am joined at the table today by Matthew Pearl, Paul Powell, and Anna Gentry of the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, Julia McHenry and Eric Byte of the Office of Economics and Analytics, Tom Sullivan of the International Bureau, and Ron Rapazzi of the Office of Engineering and Technology. In addition to the staff at the table, I would like to thank the Commission staff listed on the slide for their input. On a personal note, I found this proceeding to be one of the most complex I have ever worked on, but the team among the most talented and dedicated. The team canceled vacations, gave up holidays and weekends, missed time with their children and families, and sacrificed sleep to bring this proceeding home. I am proud to be associated with such a dedicated and talented group of public servants. Anna and Eric will now present the items. Anna?
Thank you, Don. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners.
Good morning.
The report and order of proposed modification presented for your consideration today would adopt rules to repurpose the lower 280 megahertz of the 3.7 to 4.2 gigahertz band, known as the C-band, for terrestrial wireless use through a transition mechanism designed to ensure a speed to market, efficiency of use, and effective accommodation of existing operations. The 3.7 to 4.2 gigahertz band currently is allocated to the fixed satellite service and fixed service across the full 500 megahertz. The band is primarily used by fixed satellite service satellite operators to transmit content to video and audio broadcasters, content distributors, and cable systems. The report and order would add a mobile allocation to the 3.7 to 4.0 gigahertz band and would modify the fixed satellite service allocation to restrict such services to the 4.0 to 4.2 gigahertz band. Within the contiguous United States, fixed satellite service licensees would be required to transition their services to the upper 200 megahertz by December 5th, 2025, and point-to-point fixed service licensees would be required to relocate to other bands by December 5th, 2023. Next, the report and order would adopt rules providing for an auction of overlay licenses in the 3.7 to 3.98 gigahertz band. Overlay licensees will be required to reimburse incumbent space station operators and Earth station owners for their reasonable relocation costs and would not be able to commence operations until all incumbent services have been cleared from the lower portion of the band. The report and order would provide eligible space station operators with the option to accelerate clearing in return for an accelerated relocation payment paid by the overlay licensees. Specifically, to qualify for such a payment, operators would be required to clear 120 megahertz from 3.7 to 3.82 gigahertz by December 5th, 2021, and to clear the remaining 180 megahertz from 3.82 to 4.0 gigahertz by December 5th, 2023. To facilitate the transition, the report and order would provide for a relocation payment clearinghouse that would oversee the cost-related aspects of the transition, and a relocation coordinator that would manage the timeline and coordinate the transition among incumbent operators and new overlay licensees. Finally, the report and order would adopt service and technical rules that would enable efficient and intensive use of the band by new terrestrial wireless services. The Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, the Office of Economics and Analytics, the Office of Engineering and Technology, and the International Bureau recommend adoption of the item and request editorial privileges to make technical and conforming changes. My colleague from OEA, Eric Bite, will now present the Auction 107 comment public notice. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. Today's public notice seeks comment on auction procedures for Auction 107, which will auction new flexible use overlay licenses in the 3.7 to 3.98 gigahertz band, and release 280 megahertz of critical mid-band spectrum into the commercial marketplace for 5G. As established in the report and order, this spectrum will be licensed in 20 megahertz subblocks by partial economic area for a total of approximately 5,700 licenses. The public notice proposes typical pre-auction procedures, including limited information procedures to preserve anonymous bidding and upfront payment amounts to establish bidder eligibility. In addition, the item proposes bidding credit caps that are consistent with those the Commission adopted for auctions 101, 102, and 103. The public notice proposes bidding procedures that are largely consistent with the procedures the Commission adopted for auctions 102 and 103. It proposes an ascending clock auction format with two categories of generic blocks in each PEA. As the auction progresses, the clock price for blocks in a bidding category in each PEA will increase from round to round if bidders indicate total demand that exceeds the number of blocks available in the category. The clock rounds will continue until, for all categories of blocks in all PEAs, the demand for blocks does not exceed the supply of available blocks. The public notice proposes minimum opening bid amounts that vary with market population. It proposes an activity requirement of between 90% and 100% of a bidder's eligibility in all clock rounds. The public notice proposes procedures for an assignment phase, which would allow winning clock phase bidders the opportunity to bid for frequency-specific license assignments. Finally, the public notice proposes an additional default payment of 15%, which is consistent with auctions 101, 102, and 103. The Office of Economics and Analytics and the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau recommend adoption of this public notice and request editorial privileges extending only to technical and conforming entities. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Byth, for your presentation, as well as Ms. Gentry, a presentation which can only be described as beast mode. With that, we will continue with comments from the bench, starting with Commissioner O'Reilly.
I thank the chair. This is a fantastic day, and the timing of today's order is both serendipitous and appropriate. 5 years ago, almost to the day, I was sitting at Mobile World Congress discussing the future of wireless sector with industry leaders. During a series of conversations, it became abundantly clear that the U.S. as a whole, and the Commission in particular, weren't doing enough to allocate mid-band spectrum for 5G. While industry members all said millimeter wave spectrum was useful and a component of next-generation networks, the critical ingredient was mid-band frequencies with their ideal blend of propagation and capacity. Especially outside our largest cities, mid-band would be a key to realizing the promise of increased speed and lower latency, along with a vision of a world where almost every object may be connected to the internet. From that moment on, I turned my attention to the importance of mid-bands, and more specifically the 3.7 to 4.2 gigahertz band, otherwise known as C-band, discussing it with almost anyone who would listen. But I did more than just talk, or wish, or complain. In many sessions I had over the last 5 years with wireless providers, manufacturers, the satellite industry, and the broadcasters and cable operators, which account for the vast majority of C-band transmissions, I worked hard to get the relevant parties to accept the fundamental concept. That wasn't easy, became tense at moments, and took a lot of effort, which ultimately proved fruitful. I also formulated 4 key principles along the way that would need to be addressed to execute this deal and for relocation and reallocation to be successful. First, a sufficient amount of spectrum had to be repurposed, at least between 200 and 300 megahertz. Second, it must be done quickly. There's not time to drag our proverbial feet, as the wireless industry already needed this spectrum yesterday. Third, the incumbent users of the band must be accommodated, and the satellite licensees must be on board and receive adequate compensation to give up their existing rights. Fourth, the other portion of the C-band, the 6 gigahertz, has to be open for unlicensed use. I thank the chairman for moving this critical item when the prior commission did not, and crafting an order that is generally in line with my first 3 requirements. While I may have gone down a slightly different path if I had the opportunity, I'm pleased that we are clearing 280 megahertz for auction. This landing spot took tremendous effort to achieve, as well as considerable amount of my time, energy, and patience. But it was incredibly important because new 5G wireless services are going to need wide channel allocations, and no other band provides as great an opportunity as the C-band. I also appreciate the chairman has committed to making sure that the auction happens this year. Further, if things go as planned, all incumbents should be fully accommodated with their concerns addressed. I find it highly unlikely that the Commission would turn off popular broadcast and cable programming should the restructuring of this band not be completed in 2025. At the same time, we've all had to deal with the back and forth between industry participants and Hill policymakers about incentive payments and the possible redistribution of proceeds. This is unfortunate, as many months were wasted debating whether to even provide an incentive payment to the satellite providers. The reality is that to do otherwise would have doomed this project and undermined decades of spectrum policy. Keep in mind, satellite companies provide valuable services to their contractees, but are willing to do more with less, with varying degrees of difficulty, to enable the government to meet its 5G objectives. Compensation was therefore always going to be part of the equation. In the end, almost everyone came around to this thinking, even if they may not agree with the exact funding level. Further, I believe we have the authority to compensate incumbents for their reasonable expenses and implement the accelerated relocation payments separate and apart from our auction process using our emerging technologies framework. As for my 4th principle, permitting unlicensed use in the 6 gigahertz, we have an open proceeding on that matter, and I have adequate assurances from the chairman and the staff of the OET that staff are concluding their technical analysis and preparing an order for commission consideration in the not-too-distant future. while it may not be simultaneous with this item, its forthcoming consideration will prove sufficient for me. Providing more unlicensed spectrum has been a passion of mine, and getting 6 gigahertz across the line is worth the wait. So here we are, voting on an item that represents the culmination of many years of work for me, as well as being a huge step forward in the Commission's 5G efforts. I feel a sense of accomplishment and relief at the same time. Not everything in this document is perfect, and the process probably could have been handled slightly different, but it worked out in the end. Ultimately, we are finishing on a positive upswing, worthy of our great nation's custom of facing tough tasks head-on. The chairman should be proud of his leadership and ignore the naysayers' arguments, which will fade over time, as they always do. I will approve. I thank the chair.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Carr.
Thank you. I can say it no better than my colleague, so I'll just quote her. When it comes to mid-band spectrum for 5G, I think one thing is clear. We need to move more, and we need to move faster. Those who call for more and faster movement on mid-band should celebrate this morning, because the order before us accomplishes precisely those goals. It moves more mid-band spectrum to 5G, and it moves the spectrum at a fast clip. First, the more part. The latest 5G standard is optimized for wide spectrum channels, ideally 100 megahertz or more in size. But the midband is a crowded neighborhood with government users and legacy technologies making those wide, clear channels elusive. Recognizing the imperative of midband for 5G, this commission opened a midband proceeding in 2017. Since then, we've taken action. At 3.5 gigahertz, we ensured midband works in the real world and will now auction it off this summer. With EBS, which had not been assigned in roughly half the country, we're pushing midband out into the commercial marketplace. At 2.5 gigahertz, our decision in Sprint T-Mobile enables the combined company to build out this valuable midband spectrum nationwide. At 2 gigahertz, AWS 4, we now have a binding commitment from DISH to build broadband using its midband licenses, an intensive use of the spectrum that DISH wasn't planning on absent the transaction in our decision. We're pressing ahead with 5.9 gigahertz and 6 gigahertz. And on top of all of that, diligent progress on midband, today we set up the clearing of 300 megahertz of C-band. It's not just the amount, but also the speed that matters. Time is of the essence, because we know what is at stake with 5G. $275 billion of private sector investment, without a penny in new taxes. 3 million jobs, another $500 billion in economic growth. What's more, the country that builds strong 5G first will reap the benefits of early adopter jobs and services. The $1 Trillion Club, those companies with market caps above $1 trillion, has just 4 members: Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, and Google. They're all American, and they all ride on the world's leading mobile networks here in the US. And that's not a coincidence. When the next Amazons and Apples are invented, we want them to be invented here. We want the jobs and services and opportunities centered here. Beyond global competitions and unfathomable dollar figures, we act with a sense of urgency because we know what a connection means to American families. Every day that a family lacks adequate internet access, maybe a day a doctor's appointment is missed. A picture to a loved one goes unsent. And yes, homework remains unfinished. But pointing at the digital divide while doing nothing about it isn't leadership. It's policy tourism. Here again, I'm proud to say that this commission acted decisively. We examined our authority We thought creatively about the technology options, and we pressed the parties to their limits to clear this spectrum now. This has been a tremendously complicated and important policy puzzle to solve. It involves nearly every industry the Commission regulates, and the outcome was not obvious. The best minds at this agency ground away at this for 2 years, as Don made clear, on weekends, late at night, I'm sure using a lot of comp time, relying on all of our capabilities, engineering, economics, law. The chairman and his staff deserve immense credit and our gratitude for, if nothing else, their endurance through this process. After all that, I think we landed this item in the perfect spot. We will clear 300 megahertz, which is more than incumbents ever thought they could give up, and it's enough to enable a number of providers to offer truly mobile 5G service. Americans will start benefiting from these services next year, with full clearing coming in 2023. Again, pushing the speedometer to its limit. And we'll do all of this using the FCC's tried and true auction process, using rules that are fair and known, and which will result in tens of billions of dollars being returned to the American taxpayer. You might know that we got it right, ironically, by the grumbles we hear from both sides. You didn't send enough money to the Treasury. You sent too much money to the Treasury. The equipment you're providing to incumbents is gold-plated. The equipment you're providing isn't good enough. On mid-band, it's go, go, go. But when the politics change, it's slow, 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 and on and on. At the end of a long and difficult road to compromise, and that's certainly the road that we've been on. Sometimes a little criticism from an opposing side is a sign you've landed in just the right spot. I want to thank my colleagues for agreeing to some changes to the item, moving up the election and clearing dates, for instance, so the spectrum can be used for 5G as quickly as possible. And I want to thank and congratulate everyone in this agency and all of the public commenters that engaged and made this landmark decision what it is. In particular, I want to thank the Wireless Bureau, OEA, OET, IB, OGC, OMD, EB, and the chairman and his staff for their work on the item. And thank you again, Don, for the note that you said about the work that the staff did to get here. I mean, it's something that is too often unseen, what it takes to get the work product out there to benefit the American public, and it is thanks to the hard work of the FCC staff that gets it done. So thank you for your work. It has my support.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Thanks. In the United States, we have a mid-band spectrum problem that is threatening to slow our ability to build faster 5G wireless networks. That is a fact that is universally recognized. It's the result of a few forces. For starters, much of our mid-band airwaves are already used by government agencies or commercial services. That's not true in many other parts of the world where this spectrum has been less broadly deployed and can more easily be repurposed for next-generation wireless networks. In fact, more than 24 countries have made significant progress in making mid-band airwaves the core of early 5G service, and they're already reaping the benefits. But the United States has fallen behind because instead of tackling our own mid-band shortage, we've spent the last 3 years bringing high-band airwaves to market with a series of auctions of the 24, 28, 37, 39, and 47 gigahertz bands. That's why last year I warned in Wired that the Federal Communications Commission needs to pivot from its exclusive focus on high-band spectrum to mid-band airwaves. After all, if we don't, the world will move on without us. And why? Because our efforts to date with high-band airwaves at the expense of mid-band spectrum are misguided. High-band airwaves have substantial capacity, but their signals do not travel far. As a result, commercializing them is especially costly, and that's especially true in rural areas. The sheer volume of antenna facilities required to make this service viable will limit deployment to the most populated urban areas. That means our early 5G spectrum policy has only deepened the digital divide. Along the way, we had no shortage of opportunities to address this problem. We could have held an incentive auction of spectrum in the 2.5 gigahertz band. We could have held an auction of the 3.5 gigahertz band early instead of delaying it for 3 years for picayune policy changes. We could have moved faster on our unlicensed proposals in the 5.9 gigahertz band, which have been kicking around this agency for 7 years. But we did not. We refused to acknowledge there was even a problem. And when this agency made short-sighted decisions about mid-band spectrum, I called them out. So we have today's decision. And in this proceeding, the FCC finally accepts what is obvious. We have reached the point where we have to fix our mid-band spectrum problem. We finally recognize our 5G future depends on getting this right. And to be clear, that's good news. Now, the not so good news is that the C-band may be among the most challenging slices of spectrum that the FCC has ever taken up. It has unique features that were not on congressional radar when this agency was given authority to repurpose spectrum. You can start with the fact that existing incumbents in the 3.7 to 4.2 gigahertz band share the full 500 megahertz at the same time. Plus, millions of households across the country rely on this spectrum to receive a wide range of television and radio programming. All of this means that the traditional tools available to us won't work. So with our hands already tied, the FCC tries to fix this problem the wrong way. Specifically, the FCC proposes to clear the C-band for 5G by sunsetting existing operations by 2025, and then offering incumbent satellite operators the option to accelerate their transition in exchange for a mix of reasonable relocation costs of up to $5.2 billion, plus the $9.7 billion accelerated relocation payment. Then the FCC proposes to hold a public auction of overlay licenses for new flexible use, including 5G. There are 3 things that are fundamentally flawed with this proposal. First, this decision is wrong on the law. Section 309J of the Communications Act sets forth the procedures for this agency to hold a spectrum auction. It requires that all deposits the FCC may require to bid in an auction, as well as proceeds from the use of an auction, are deposited in the United States Treasury. Consistent with this rule, under the FCC's tried and true emerging technologies framework, the agency may require new entrants to privately negotiate with incumbents and pay their reasonable relocation expenses. This very specific framework has not only been used in the past, it's actually been blessed by courts that have reviewed our auction proposals. But that's not the framework we adopt here, no matter how this decision tries to dress it up and say otherwise. The Emerging Technologies Framework is a voluntary and market-based approach to spectrum clearing. It offers new licensees the option to pay for faster access and capitalizes on the fact that a new entrant has better information about the value of relocation and an incumbent has better information about the cost. This asymmetry of information creates incentives for parties to engage in strategic bargaining, increasing the likelihood that a fair and efficient agreement can be reached. However, here, with a legal sleight of hand, the FCC takes what must be voluntary and makes it mandatory. We force C-band auction winners to pay nearly $10 billion to incumbent satellite operators over and above their relocation costs. There is no cite to any legal authority or precedent that allows us to do so. Moreover, we pluck that amount of payment out of thin air in a manner that does not reflect how market transactions work. That puts what we do here fundamentally at odds with both the Emerging Technologies Framework and Section 309J. Indeed, where Congress previously authorized the FCC to require similar payments in the context of an incentive auction, it required the agency to use a competitive reverse auction to facilitate price discovery and then give forward auction participants the choice to pay for it. Nor do we square our decision with the court's finding in Teledesic versus FCC that any voluntary incentive payment must be proportionate to the cost of providing replacement facilities. There's no attempt here to explain how the acceleration payment is tied at all to facilitating access to the C-band, beyond placating the largest incumbents. All of this means that this decision forces auction winners to make an arbitrary payment that reduces the proceeds the government would otherwise realize at auction. Again, this is not what the Emerging Technologies Framework permits. It's not what is contemplated in Section 309J of the Communications Act. The FCC has no legal authority to require any payments to incumbents that extend beyond actual and reasonable relocation costs. Remember that Section 309J is explicit that all deposits the FCC may require at auction, as well as all proceeds from the auction, must flow to the United States Treasury. The FCC tries to get around this requirement by suggesting it can create a third category of auction-related payments that are not deposits or proceeds. But by doing so, the FCC is reducing revenues that statutorily must go to the Treasury, and it is undermining the congressional power of the purse. Indeed, if we accept the FCC's argument here, it is hard to imagine any limitation on the agency's ability to require payments for any purpose that even loosely can be connected to some spectrum-related goal as a condition of auction participation. And that simply cannot be true. As a result, it is flat-out disingenuous to suggest that the authority to make this so-called acceleration payment is established in the Emerging Technologies Framework, because it is not. Second, this decision is wrong on the economics. Comb through this decision and you will not find a rational basis for the $9.7 billion we are set to give away in this repurposing of the C-band. It's not the result of data-driven decision-making. It's back-of-the-envelope math. It looks a lot like an effort to justify backroom deals and promised payoffs. That's not the kind of decision a federal agency should be making. That's a question more appropriately answered by Congress or the markets. What is most disappointing is that just over a year ago, the FCC launched the Office of Economics and Analytics to tackle the hardest issues before us, just like here with the C-band. A key objective of this office, we were told, was providing independent economic analysis to inform the agency's decisions. But in the first big test of this office's abilities, this proceeding, the economics experts are nowhere to be found. That's too bad, because it would have been nice to know what they thought about all the issues raised in this proceeding. Here's an example. Early in the decision, the agency discusses the calculation of the benefits associated with an accelerated transition. We cite one economist who says that for every year of delay in making C-band available, consumer welfare is reduced by $15 billion. Another estimates that 1 year of delay would reduce the value of repurposing the C-band from 7 to 11%. But we do no analysis ourselves. Next, the FCC tackles the relocation costs of the transition. It ticks through all the best guesses in the record. The C-band Alliance estimates that the total cost to clear 300 megahertz in the contiguous United States would be $2.8 billion. Eutelsat estimates $3.5 billion. ACA puts the number closer to $6.1 billion. So what does the office we set up to do independent analysis think? We don't know. Because instead of doing the work ourselves, we just go halvesies and pick a range in the middle. We do the same when it comes to predicting the prices that bidders will pay for licensees to operate on this spectrum. We list the best guesses of the Public Interest Spectrum Coalition, the Brattle Group, the C-band Alliance, Kerrisdale Capital Management, and American Action Forum, and then pick 50 cents per megahertz pop. Because, again, we say, well, it's in the middle. We do no independent analysis of our own. Finally, it is hard to square our economic analysis with our decision to dismiss pre-auction aggregation limits, which could limit 5G competition in the future. Likewise, the performance obligations here are divorced from the economic reality that they can be a tool to facilitate faster and more widespread 5G deployment. In fact, we only require carriers to build out this spectrum to 45% of the population within 8 years. Good luck with rural deployment, because that does not suggest a whole lot of urgency. Third, this decision is wrong on policy. With today's action, the FCC substitutes its will for the will of Congress. By acting unilaterally, this agency is not only exceeding its authority under the law, it is denying the legislative branch the ability to produce a statute that gets us where we want to go on 5G and mid-band spectrum. It also denies us all the ability to take the funds from the auction of these public airwaves and put them to broader public purpose than those that are contemplated in the existing statute. Working with Congress, we can use the billions of dollars in revenues this auction could raise to do the very infrastructure projects this country so desperately needs. And what might those involve? We could start with using this auction as a vehicle for Congress to repeal the provision in the Middle Class Tax Relief and Job Creation Act that requires the FCC to auction the T-band spectrum 1 year from now. This auction will jeopardize the communications of police and fire officials in New York, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Washington, Chicago, Dallas, Houston, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Boston, and Miami. We should be looking for every implement in our policy toolkit to help prevent this public safety mess, including support from the revenues associated with this spectrum auction. Next, we could use the billions of dollars raised in auction revenue to do other big things. We could do audacious things. We could start a new initiative to help with rural broadband. We could fund the nation's transition to next-generation 911, which is sorely needed and would benefit public safety in every state. Or we could use some of the revenues to seed a homework gap trust fund to help our nation's students stuck in the digital divide. It could support Wi-Fi hotspots for loan in every school library and eliminate the homework gap virtually overnight. But because we act now, we handicap the funding Congress could secure and risk discounting the value of this auction in the eyes of the Congressional Budget Office. We deny Congress its rightful role in setting auction policy, plus we take a pass on what is truly needed: a legislative overhaul of our system for incentivizing the return of airwaves and the repurposing of them for a future where we can lead in 5G. For all of these reasons, I dissent.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Starks.
We live in an age when the demand for wireless service is growing at an almost exponential pace. It seems like everyone is on their smartphone, on the street, in the subway, and even the commissioners tweeting up here on the dais. But there are less obvious activities that take place too, like the utility connecting sensors throughout its power grid to monitor energy consumption, the manufacturer placing inventory tracking monitors throughout its factory, or in the city installing routers on its buses to provide free Wi-Fi to its passengers. The demand will only increase exponentially in time with full deployment of fifth-generation wireless service and its capabilities kicking things into high gear. 5G and the applications that will grow from it are critical to our economic future. They promise to change the way we work, increase our health and safety, create new opportunities for education and entertainment. The number of 5G connections is growing fast around the world, and according to one recent study, the number of 5G global connections will reach 1.3 billion by 2025, covering 40% of the world's population, or approximately 2.7 billion people. Mid-band spectrum like that at issue in this proceeding is essential to this shared future. Compared to the millimeter wave spectrum that has been the focus of late, transmissions in mid-band spectrum can travel greater distances and penetrate farther into buildings. Moreover, mid-band spectrum is not only important for 5G, but can also help address the problem of internet inequality by connecting people who live outside the most densely populated urban centers. And while the Commission has been working on other mid-band spectrum bands, none have received quite nearly as much attention in the last few years as the C-band. Among other purposes, this band is currently used by fixed satellite service operators to deliver programming to broadcasters and cable providers. However, the overall use of the C-band has been declining for decades as customers take advantage of alternative technologies. The underused nature of this band, combined with its size and proximity to the 3.5, make it an ideal candidate for reallocation. And so we must seize this great opportunity. But in its haste to make this spectrum available for new terrestrial uses, the majority has, I believe, overstretched our legal precedent and entered into a deal that will take money from American taxpayers for foreign satellite operators who may not even keep their end of the bargain. I'm concerned that today's order ultimately will benefit these satellite operators and the largest of our wireless carriers at the expense of competition and American taxpayers. The days of easy spectrum decision-making are truly over. The low-hanging fruit has been plucked. While technology continues to make feasible the use of spectrum bands where terrestrial wireless use was previously deemed impossible, there is only so much spectrum to go around. Basic physics dictates that we must re-examine our current spectrum allocations to determine where we can operate more efficiently. And for the foreseeable future, spectrum policymaking will likely require progressively more difficult decisions, including the possibility that we will need to relocate entrenched incumbents to make room for new entrants and new technologies. And that's why it's so critical that we get today right. Incumbents everywhere are watching, assessing whether the FCC proceeds based on well-established and principled bases, and what it will mean for parties that seek similar arrangements in the future. As today's decision makes clear, the Commission has broad authority under Section 316 of the Communications Act to modify existing licenses where doing so would serve the public interest. Nor is the Commission required to have licensees consent. All that is necessary for the agency to find that modification, quote, serves the public interest, convenience, and necessity, close quote. And while the agency cannot fundamentally change a license under the section, a modification is permissible, or a licensee can continue to provide substantially the same service. Members of the C-band Alliance have repeatedly dashed our hopes of quickly making C-band spectrum available for terrestrial wireless use by threatening to sue and overturn an order. They have argued that they deserve not only reasonable reallocation expenses, but also a windfall. And to make matters worse, they sought to control the process for license reassignment and payments through a private sale or auction, arguing that it would be the fastest way to put C-band spectrum to use. Several months ago, I said enough, and was the first on the Commission to demand that this be a public auction. I'm glad that my colleagues agree with me here today and have said yes to the public auction function. But I must object, as I mentioned, to the majority's response to these satellite operators' demands. To be clear, I recognize that the threat of litigation and bankruptcy is real and could delay the availability of this important spectrum band. I also recognize that the emerging technologies line of cases in which the Commission created an incentive regime to encourage incumbent licensees to expedite spectrum reallocation efforts. But those cases make clear that while the Commission can require winning bidders to contribute to a fund for the benefit of incumbent licensees, those mandatory payments are limited to reasonable reallocation costs. In those proceedings, any payment to encourage incumbents to expedite their departure from the affected spectrum beyond ordinary relocation costs resulted from voluntary negotiations between bidders and incumbents subject to Commission oversight. In this case, rather than voluntary payments negotiated between private parties, the majority has adopted a scheme of mandatory payments from winning bidders into a fund calculated and divided via a process that still remains a mystery. Such an approach is not supported, I think, by our statutory authority. In Section 309J, authorizes the Commission to conduct competitive bidding for licenses to operate consistent with those agency rules. It does not include the authority to require, in addition, that winning bidders contribute towards a fund that would result in billions of dollars paid to these satellite incumbent operators beyond their reasonable relocation costs. The majority points to the Commission's authority to require payment of these costs as support for its mandatory accelerated relocation payment, but the order does not cite any authority permitting the Commission to require those winning bidders to compensate incumbents above those reasonable costs. Instead, the majority discusses potential issues with a voluntary negotiation scheme and the economic benefits of an accelerated rollout of 5G in the C-band. None of those create new legal authority in the scheme that we adopt today. The approach in today's order creates a potential spectrum policy headache, I fear, that we will be addressing for years to come. For the foreseeable future, this agency will have to redistribute underutilized spectrum away from incumbents, federal and non-federal as they may be, to make it available for more efficient use, and requiring billions of dollars in mandatory payments to incumbents here will only encourage the demands of similar treatment for similarly situated incumbents. This may not be especially problematic for large, well-funded bidders, but the additional expense of mandatory contributions towards an accelerated relocation may place bidders with fewer resources at significant financial disadvantage. The issues do not stop simply with the mandatory nature of the incentive payments. Such payments, as I mentioned, must be proportionate to the cost of providing comparable facilities. In this case, the majority here, again, does not calculate additional costs to satellite operators on an expedited exit from the lower portion of the C-band. And even if we accepted the Commission that they can require bidders to make incentive payments unrelated to the cost of accelerated relocation and set the exact amount of those payments, how we arrived at the precise $9.7 billion figure is not fully explained, simply to me. Late last week, SES introduced an accounting firm's analysis, attested to by members of the C-band Alliance at the time, describing the 27 C-band downlink revenue shares for these operators. This order asserts that this filing is the, quote, best evidence in the record, close quote, in support of the division of the $9.7 billion in accelerated relocation payments because it reflects the C-band Alliance members' own understanding of their relative contributions to clearing the spectrum. I do not believe that we should delegate our statutory responsibilities and provide billions of dollars to foreign satellite operators based primarily on an opaque private agreement between parties that stand to benefit most from our decision. Even if we ignore those issues, we still have the underlying problem that nothing in the record suggests that 9.7 has any actual relation to the costs satellite operators will incur if they expedite their relocation. These financial and legal gymnastics, we're told in the end, will ensure that the C-band will be put to terrestrial use as quickly as possible. But as the events of the last few weeks have shown, the foundation of that fundamental bargain could be crumbling as the satellite operators have fought over how to divide this $9.7 billion. Truly, the C-band Alliance has turned into a circular firing squad. In the end, after years of debate and thousands of pages of comments, it would be ironic if, having compromised on so much, we end up in the same position that we so desperately wanted to avoid, stuck and mired in litigation without any auction ready to go. It is a real possibility as we sit here at this moment, and it didn't have to be this way. One final note. Congress directed the Commission to design auctions that, quote, promote economic opportunity and competition by avoiding excessive concentration of licenses and by disseminating those licenses among a wide variety of applicants, including small businesses, rural telephone companies, businesses owned by minority groups, and women, close quote. This proceeding not only represents an important opportunity to spur the future deployment of 5G, but also encourage wireless competition and diversity. As noted earlier, by requiring mandatory payments into an accelerated relocation fund, we may discourage auction participation by smaller, less well-funded bidders. And I'm disappointed that we're refusing to place reasonable spectrum aggregation limits on the auction. Multiple parties representing small and rural carriers have urged the Commission to consider such limits and to protect competition and ensure that a wide variety of applicants have access to this spectrum. While I disagree with much of the reasoning of this order, I would truly be remiss, especially as a former staffer here at the FCC, not to acknowledge what is hard work for sure. And so thank you to the Commission for your service.
Thank you, Commissioner. Securing United States leadership in 5G is a national priority. One study pegs 5G's economic potential at 3 million new jobs, $275 billion in private investment, and $500 billion in new economic growth. You can quibble with the numbers, but there's no question that 5G networks will be an important platform for innovation and investment in the coming years, as were 4G LTE and the mobile app economy it enabled over a decade ago. That explains why countries around the world are jockeying for global leadership in 5G. Whoever sets the pace globally will become the frontrunner in the development of the 5G ecosystem and attract the jobs, the growth, and the consumer benefits that come with that status. And I want the past to be prologue. I want America's success in 5G to match our leadership in 4G. And that is why the FCC has been pursuing a strategy to facilitate America's superiority in 5G technology, the 5G FAST Plan. By executing that plan, the Commission has already made an unprecedented amount of spectrum available for commercial, flexible wireless use. In the high bands, we have successfully concluded our nation's first 2 millimeter wave auctions in the 28 gigahertz and 24 gigahertz band. And our ongoing auction of the 37, 39, and 47 gigahertz bands will soon come to a successful end. With respect to low-band spectrum, the transition of the 600 megahertz band for wireless use is on schedule, notwithstanding many predictions to the contrary. Indeed, mobile network operators are already delivering 5G services using this band. We've also taken decisive action with respect to mid-band spectrum, which is appealing for 5G as it combines good geographic coverage with good capacity. Notwithstanding the fact that we started this administration with the cupboard bare, we have now made more spectrum in the 2.5 gigahertz band available for 5G. We've reformed the rules regarding the 3.5 gigahertz band to encourage 5G deployment and will be auctioning licenses in that band this summer. We've approved the T-Mobile-Sprint merger, which, as the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York recently recognized, will allow critical mid-band spectrum to be used for 5G. And today, we adopt an order that will repurpose 280 megahertz of spectrum in the mid-band for flexible use, which will help deliver 5G services to consumers across our country and promote our global leadership. During this proceeding, I made it clear that my decision would be guided by 4 principles. First, the FCC must make a substantial amount of spectrum in the C-band available for 5G. Second, we must do so quickly. Third, we must generate revenue for the federal government. And fourth, we must ensure that the services that are currently delivered using the C-band can continue to be delivered to the American people. The order the FCC majority today advances promotes each of these principles. I'll start with the first 2. This item will make a large swath of mid-band spectrum available for 5G and will do so quickly. From Congress to my fellow commissioners, to wireless providers, to equipment manufacturers, virtually everyone agrees that we need to act expeditiously to make a large amount of C-band spectrum available for 5G. Among other things, doing so will help close the digital divide, enabling all Americans, whether they live in rural or urban areas, to access new and innovative 5G applications and services. To ensure that the 280 megahertz of repurposed spectrum from 3.7 gigahertz to 3.98 gigahertz is made available for flexible wireless use as quickly as possible, the order provides for accelerated relocation payments for satellite operators if they meet deadlines for clearing C-band spectrum quickly. Why are accelerated relocation payments necessary? The answer is simple: speed. We want satellite operators to vacate the lower portion of the C-band quickly. And this transition will be much faster if we align the incentives of satellite operators with the incentives of wireless providers who want expedited access to that spectrum. To properly align those incentives, we are giving satellite operators the opportunity to receive accelerated relocation payments of $9.7 billion if they meet our accelerated clearing milestones. Now, some believe that these accelerated relocation payments are too small. Others have criticized them as being too big. But, as Goldilocks might say, I believe we've gotten it just right. We arrived at this figure by working with our talented economists in the Office of Economic and Analytics, as well as other expert staff, to determine the value of auction winners of having satellite operators clear the spectrum in an accelerated time frame, and to approximate the size of payments that would be made in the private marketplace absent holdout and free rider obstacles. Now, turning to my third principle, I believe that a public auction run by our outstanding staff here at the FCC will be the best way to ensure that we generate revenue for the federal government and value for American taxpayers. And that auction will start later this year, on December 8th. The FCC has a quarter-century track record of successful and transparent auctions. In fact, as of late last year, the Commission had conducted 93 spectrum auctions that generated over $117 billion in revenue for the United States Treasury. And that doesn't include the ongoing auction of the upper 37, 39, and 47 gigahertz bands, which, as I mentioned, is wrapping up and has already attracted over $7.5 billion in gross bids. And we conduct our auctions in a fair, trusted, and transparent way, one that assigns flexible use licenses quickly and would be difficult, if not impossible, for a private sale to replicate. With respect to this principle of revenue for the federal government, it is important to make a couple of points about accelerated relocation payments. First, they will be made by wireless carriers, not the FCC and not by the American taxpayer. And second, to the extent they impact the proceeds of the auction at all, they are likely to increase those proceeds. And that is because without a strong incentive for satellite operators to cooperate, it will take years longer to clear the spectrum, dramatically reducing the value of this spectrum opportunity to wireless bidders. It's like repainting your house before you sell it. Yes, there are costs to doing that, but the costs are more than offset by the higher sales price. And our conservative approach here means the costs of accelerated relocation are easily outweighed by the benefits to the Treasury, not to mention the benefits to the public at large. As for the fourth principle, the Commission is adopting a transition plan for this band that will ensure that the American people are able to receive C-band services in a continuous and uninterrupted manner. The item lays out a comprehensive and systematic transition process that will ensure that all incumbents are held harmless, including registered Earth station operators that will be able to continue serving over 110 million households. And the record is clear that services provided through the C-band today can be delivered in the future through the upper 200 megahertz of that band. The substance of today's order is sound. But as to process, its timing, there are some who argue that we should wait indefinitely. They complain that we are refusing to sit on our hands and wait for Congress to legislate. It is at once amusing and astounding that some making this criticism are the very same people who have previously complained that the agency isn't moving quickly enough on mid-band spectrum. Indeed, by now it has become a tired refrain. Demand action on mid-band spectrum, but vote against putting 2.5 gigahertz spectrum to work for American consumers. Demand action on mid-band spectrum, but vote against making the 3.5 gigahertz band a test bed for 5G. Demand action on mid-band spectrum, but vote against letting new T-Mobile put underused spectrum to work in rural America. Demand action on mid-band spectrum, but vote against every single one of the wireless infrastructure reforms needed to enable that spectrum to actually be used for 5G. Demand action on mid-band spectrum, but vote against the C-band public auction that will help ensure American leadership in 5G. For some, the imperative of criticizing the Commission to score cheap political points, no matter the issue, appears to outweigh the importance of holding positions that bear even a semblance of internal consistency. We see this tactic of diametrically opposed talk and action a lot in Washington. Some in the Beltway quietly accommodate themselves to it. Others gleefully praise it as savvy. But the American people see it for what it is, a pretzel, not a principle. So let me be clear regarding this tepid call to change course and sit still. For those waiting with bated breath for that favorite catchphrase, the U-turn, I have only one thing to say. U-turn if you want to. This chairman's not for turning. The goal of leading the world in 5G is too urgent, the need to close the digital divide too pressing for us to put off action indefinitely. The time to act is now, and we are acting. And we should, in part, because the law says we can. The Communications Act requires that the FCC act in the public interest and gives us ample legal authority to move forward with this public auction. Section 316 of the Act allows us to modify the licenses of C-band incumbents. Section 309 of the Act authorizes a public auction of the lower 280 megahertz of the C-band for flexible use overlay licenses. Section 303 of the Act gives us the authority to set new technical rules for the band. And Section 303R of the Act lets us require the winners of the public auction to pay for the relocation of the band's incumbents under our emerging technologies framework. Now, of course, I'm always open to input from Congress, and if Congress passes legislation after our vote today that revenue from this auction can supplement the $20 billion the Commission dedicated to closing the digital divide just last month, I'm all for it. But as the chairman of the FCC, it would be irresponsible for me to do nothing on a spectrum band vital for 5G in the hopes that a Congress under divided control and in an election year is going to pass C-band legislation addressing the difficult issues ably resolved by today's order. Now, our decision today benefited greatly from the extensive comments in the record and feedback from a variety of stakeholders. In particular, I would like to thank those members of the satellite industry, mobile wireless providers, wireless internet service providers, cable operators, and content distributors who engaged in these issues in good faith and provided constructive feedback on our proposals. In order for the C-band transition to be a success, we will need to see continued cooperation and constructive engagement from all these stakeholders. And most of all, I would like to thank our hardworking FCC staff. Mr. Stockdale put it well. This is likely the most complicated proceeding any of us have ever seen. And I know firsthand how many hours, how many nights, how many weekends were spent laboring on this issue. We couldn't have gotten to this point without the fantastic career staff arrayed before us and others who aren't even in the room. And so, with the indulgence of my colleagues, I will read the names because it's important for the American people to know who delivered value on their behalf. From the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, Ken Baker, Steve Buenzo, Peter Duranko, Thomas Derringe, Connie Diaz, Kamran Etemad, Anna Gentry, Jessica Grafenius, Joyce Jones, Susanna Larson, Roger Knoll, Matthew Pearl, Paul Powell, Jessica Quinley, Jacqueline Rosen, Blaise Cinto, Dana Schaefer, Max Staloff, Don Stockdale, Cecilia Sulhoff, Becky Tangren, Jeff Tigner, Brian Wondrak, and Janet Young. And that's just from WTB. From the Office of Economics and Analytics, Valerie Barish, Eric Beith, Craig Bomberger, Jonathan Campbell, Rita Cook-Meyer, Patrick DeGraba, Shabnam Javed, Daniel Habif, Bill Huber, Pramesh Jobanputra, Evan Quirell, Paul LaFontaine, Julia McHenry, Elliot Manor, Taima Rahimich, Eric Salavara, Linda Sanderson, Martha Stansel, Stu Sterner, Patrick Sun, and Margie Wiener. From the Office of Engineering and Technology, Baman Badipur, Michael Ha, Ira Keltz, Tom Mooring, Nick Oros, Robert Pavlek, Barbara Pavon, and Ron Rapazzi. From the International Bureau, Jose Albuquerque, Paul Blaise, Jamie Ann Fuller, Jennifer Gilsonen, Carrie Murray, Bob Nelson, Jim Schlichting, and Tom Sullivan. From the Office of General Counsel, Deborah Broderson, Michael Carlson, David Horowitz, Tom Johnson, and Bill Richardson. From the Office of Communications Business Opportunities, Shanna Wilkerson. From the Office of Managing Director, Dan Daly, Sonny Diemert, Don DiGiorgio, Jay Song, Timothy Sakirka, Dina Shetler, and Mark Stevens. From the Enforcement Bureau, Chris Killian and Jeremy Marcus. And from the Office of the Chairman, a heartfelt thank you to Aaron Goldberger, Nick Degani, and Matthew Barry, all of whom spent a lot of time working on this order, and it got us across the finish line. With that, we will proceed to a vote on item number 1. Item number 1 is expanding flexible use of the C-band. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Aye.
Commissioner Carr.
Approved.
Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Dissent.
Commissioner Starks.
Dissent.
The chair votes to approve. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Now we'll proceed to a vote on item number 2. Item number 2 is C-band auction bidding procedures. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Aye.
Commissioner Carr.
Approved.
Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Dissent.
Commissioner Starks.
Dissent.
The chairman votes to approve. The item is adopted with editorial, editorial privileges granted as requested. Thanks again, folks, for the great work. Get some rest. Madam Secretary, please, if you could take us to, welcome back. All right. The next item on today's agenda.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, the third item on your agenda will be presented by the Office of Economics and Analytics and is entitled Auction of Priority Access Licenses for the 3550 to 3650 megahertz band, and Julia McHenry, Chief of the Office, will give the introduction.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Ms. McHenry, when you and your team are ready, the floor is yours.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. I am pleased to present to you the procedures public notice for Auction 105, an auction of priority access licenses in the 3.5 gigahertz band. I am joined at the table today by Jonathan Campbell and Bill Huber of the Auctions Division, Don Stockdale and Jessica Quinley of the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau. In addition to the staff at the table, I would like to to thank the staff from the Office of Economics and Analytics, the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, the Office of Communications Business Opportunities, the Office of Managing Director, the Office of General Counsel, who are listed on the slide for their input. I would also like to give a special thanks to Mary Lovejoy, who could not be with us today, but really led through this item. With that, Bill will now present the item.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. Today's public notice, which would adopt procedures for Auction 105, is an essential step towards the June 25th, 2020 start of bidding for priority access licenses, also known as PALs, in a portion of the 3.5 gigahertz band. Putting this mid-band spectrum, which is prime spectrum for 5G and other advanced wireless services, into the commercial marketplace is another critical component of the Commission's 5G FAST plan. The auction will offer 7 PALs in each county-based license area for a total of 22,631 licenses. Each PAL will consist of a generic 10 megahertz unpaired channel in the 3550 to 3650 megahertz band. Consistent with the Commission's aggregation rules, potential priority access licensees will be permitted to bid for and hold up to 4 PALs per county in each bidding round. The public notice adopts procedures relating to the application process. Short form applications to bid for licenses in Auction 105 may be filed between March 26th and April 9th. As required by the Prohibited Communications Rule, applicants will be prohibited from communicating bidding information with other applicants and nationwide providers of communication services until after the close of bidding. In addition, the item adopts the same bidding credit caps for small businesses and rural service providers that were proposed in this proceeding and that were adopted for auctions 101, 102, and 103. The public notice also adopts bidding procedures for a clock auction that largely mirror the procedures the Commission adopted for auctions 102 and 103. Auction 105's clock auction format will allow bidding for generic blocks in successive clock bidding rounds on a county-by-county basis. In a departure from other recent spectrum auctions, however, Auction 105 will not include an assignment phase, since frequency coordinators, known as spectrum access systems, will dynamically assign the specific frequencies associated with each PAL. The public notice adopts upfront payment amounts and minimum opening bids that vary by market population, as proposed in the Auction 105 comment PN. Further, the public notice adopts an initial clock price increment of 10%, which the Commission can adjust upward or downward within a range of 5 to 20% as the auction proceeds, as well as an activity requirement between 90 and 100% of a bidder's bidding eligibility in all clock rounds, starting at 95% for the initial round. The clock rounds of the auctions will continue until, for all counties, the number of blocks demanded does not exceed the supply of available blocks. The public notice also establishes an aggregate reserve price of nearly $108 million, which is 110% of the amount of estimated sharing costs for federal incumbents that was provided to us by the National Telecommunications and Information Administration. The Office of Economics and Analytics and the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau recommend adoption of this public notice and request editorial privileges extending only to technical and conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you for the presentation. We'll now turn to comments from the bench, beginning with Commissioner O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is amazing how much time has been devoted to the 3.5 gigahertz band to get us here today. As the chairman's point person on this project, I am extremely proud of the efforts it took us from a 3-tiered structure that included priority access licenses designed to discourage participation by many in the wireless sector to a compromise plan reflected in the October 2018 order, and now to procedures that will allow a successful PAL auction. We will finally auction 10 megahertz county-size licenses with standard license terms that are renewable, providing potential bidders with confidence that if they invest, build, and serve Americans and follow the rules, they will not be at risk of losing their licenses and stranding investment. As I've previously stated, this mid-band spectrum is incredibly significant for 5G and other advanced wireless services. Accordingly, today's item is very important for three main reasons. First, we decide not to pursue the option of CMA-level bidding packages as previously proposed. While I remain unconvinced by the arguments against it, I must take into account the views of all potential bidders. Declining to pursue package bidding here should help calm the waters from any remaining complainers without altering auction participants or participation or results. Second, while it is not embedded in the document itself, we gained a commitment from the Department of Defense that there would likely be no new DoD sites needing protection. This has become an issue over the last many months as previously unaccounted for sites were suddenly being located and now needed to be protected by the ESCs and SASs. Since the goalposts kept moving, it became difficult to establish a foundation for purposes of determining the utility and value of the non-federal spectrum. With this new understanding, unless something dramatic or drastic changes, this process should be completed, and that is a good development. Third, the item signifies that we are ready to move on from the previous debates and tackling the remaining work to be done in this band. Specifically, everyone involved in CBRS, including DoD, is mindful that the power limit restrictions on PALs and GAA are woefully inadequate, especially in rural America. Along with unlicensed like GAA spectrum, these licenses provide an excellent opportunity for fixed service providers like WISPs and smaller mobile providers. Potential users are interested in finding economical solutions to expand into unserved remote areas, but they need higher power in 3.5 gigahertz to do so. DoD has already agreed to look into this, but we need a defined and definitive timeline for this to review, along with a clear process to evaluate whether the dynamic protection areas can be reduced in size. The Commission has acquiesced to the argument that the current statutory reimbursement structure applies in this instance. We weren't necessarily required to do so under the statute. This decision should provide DoD with funding by the end of the year for research and testing of higher power limits. That process should be able to be completed by the end of next year, if not sooner. I will continue to push on this matter to get finalized as soon as possible. We may also need to consider how to migrate and mitigate harmful interference between future C-band licensees and CBRS users. For now, we are able to finally proceed to the auction, which will allow the Commission to put these licenses, which have been in consideration for about a decade now, into the hands of innovators, entrepreneurs, service providers, and industries that have been clamoring for mid-band licenses for all these years. Not to mention, these will be the first frequencies, 70 megahertz in total, put into the marketplace that can be used for 5G networks. After all the speculation, and at some points pessimism, we'll find out who's interested in these licenses and for which uses. I personally can't wait to see how this band develops and what services are offered. I thank the Chairman for bringing this item before the Commission and taking the necessary steps to ensure a successful auction in June. I will approve.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Carr.
Thanks. This is more good news for U.S. leadership in 5G. It's more mid-band spectrum that we're going to be auctioning off and getting out into the commercial marketplace this year. So thank you so much for your work on the item. Thank you to Commissioner O'Reilly for his leadership as well in getting this to a spot where it's going to work in practice for the American people. It has my support. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Mark your calendar, because this vote is big. It's a major milestone in United States spectrum policy, and that's because the wireless auction we schedule today features something truly radical. A framework for sharing that can turn spectrum scarcity into abundance. That's very cool. But as exciting as this moment is, it's also a little bit bittersweet, and that's because we should have been celebrating this achievement years ago. Let me begin with what makes this effort so profound. And to do so, I think it's important to put it in context. We have a long tradition of spectrum innovation in the United States. When it comes to wireless policy, we have a history of embracing ideas that are cool, kooky, and new before anyone else. After all, it was about 2.5 decades ago that we took the academic ideas of Ronald Coase and ushered in a whole new era of spectrum auctions. We also pioneered the use of unlicensed spectrum, the airwaves we now know and use every day as Wi-Fi. More recently, we blazed a trail for two-sided incentive auctions, and with each of these efforts, we reoriented ourselves from what was to what could be. In doing so, we changed the way that wireless systems are developed and distributed, not just domestically, but worldwide. 5 years ago, this agency recognized that our traditional spectrum auctions needed an update too, and that the 3.5 gigahertz band was the perfect place to start. Instead of relying on the traditional binary choice between licensed and unlicensed, the agency adopted an unprecedented three-tiered model of spectrum sharing and management. Under this three-tiered system, incumbent government users have a primary and preemptive right. But we know they do not need access all of the time everywhere, so we created a secondary license opportunity, custom-built for small cells. Then, to the extent that the demand for these licenses is limited, opportunistic use is permitted by rule. And to coordinate this grand effort, we promoted dynamic spectrum access systems. Now, here's the best part. The framework we put in place for the 3.5 gigahertz band was ideal for 5G too. The very structure of this band recognized that the smartphone might be the least interesting thing about our 5G future. Instead, this was designed for innovation. It recognized that we're on the verge of a new networked world with connectivity built into everything around us. So in addition to the familiar carriers, we saw early interest in this band from entities that support industrial operations and who wanted to use this spectrum for intelligent manufacturing, power generation and distribution, and healthcare. Our record supported its use for advanced inspection and sensor technologies, including aerial drones, terrestrial crawlers, and robotics. The American Petroleum Institute expressed interest in using it for updating drilling operations, and the Port of Los Angeles wanted to explore its use for sharing shipping data. Plus, rural interests saw a unique opportunity to bring more service and more competition to remote areas of the country that are too often left behind. Now, all of this required us to operate with a heavy dose of humility, because at the heart of our initial plan for the 3.5 gigahertz band was the recognition that the Federal Communications Commission could not know the best use cases for 5G. Who will have the best business models for deploying it, or who will have the best way to extend 5G service to rural communities? So instead of choosing winners and losers in this band by adopting rules that were biased towards certain users or the same old carriers, we developed policies to balance the services we know today with opportunities for those that might be coming our way tomorrow. All right, now for the bittersweet. It never should have taken us this long to get here. We started down this road 5 years ago. During the intervening years, we've hemmed and hawed and revisited some of the fundamentals of our new framework. We lost our nerve and in key ways retreated back to the old. Then we claimed that these changes made this portion of our airwaves more 5G friendly. But the honest truth is that these changes exposed our lack of imagination and a misunderstanding of what 5G is, what it needs, and what it can do. Most notably, we expanded license sizes from census tracts to counties, shutting out new 5G spectrum interests that cannot compete at that scale. Then we proposed even larger service territories at auction. I'm glad that we don't continue on this course in today's decision, because it would narrow even further the range of spectrum interests that could use these airwaves. I'm also glad that we honor the hard-fought compromise that kept service areas in this band defined by counties. In addition, it's important to remember that we didn't get this far alone. It wasn't that long ago that the 3.5 gigahertz band was coveted military spectrum. Creating this opportunity, combining incumbent use with new commercial licensed and unlicensed use, took a lot of effort. It took working with our federal partners to reach a shared goal. We're going to need a whole lot more of that kind of cooperation and coordination if we want to realize greater success in securing mid-band spectrum for new mobile use. But lately, when it comes to 5G policy, it feels like the right hand of the government's not talking to the left. We've seen it in this administration's all-too-public disputes about supply chain security, protecting weather radar, and traffic safety. In fact, late last year, the bipartisan leadership of the Senate Committees on Intelligence, Homeland Security, and Governmental Affairs, Foreign Affairs, and Armed Services wrote the White House expressing concern that we do not have a coordinated plan for a secure 5G future, and that we need one. I think they're right. I also think that today's effort, despite it all, represents real progress. We have the first mid-band auction of the 5G era now on our calendar. We have a genuinely creative framework for wireless sharing. It's an important new chapter in the history of spectrum policy in the United States. I'd also like to thank the staff who have been working for too long, on bringing this vision of the 3.5 gigahertz band to market. So a special shout out to John Leibowitz, who championed this effort early and often, and I also want to thank my colleague, Commissioner O'Reilly, for following through.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Starks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today, we take another step forward towards making critical mid-band spectrum available for advanced broadband services. Just last month, the Commission authorized full commercial operations in the 3.5 band by 4 spectrum access system operators. This summer's auction sets the stage for consumers to begin to realize the benefits of this spectrum. In fact, consumers already have smartphones from Apple, Google, Samsung with the capability to use 3.5 spectrum. I want to note one significant change in the item from last year's initial public notice on the proposed auction procedures, as we heard about. In my statement accompanying that decision, I raised concerns about the proposal to allow bidding at the CMA level and some of the issues that I saw of unintended consequences, particularly in discouraging or disadvantaging competition by small bidders. And so I'm happy with that folks shared that concern and raised issues and that we're not proceeding with that approach. Thank you to the team for the hard work.
Thank you, Commissioner. This public notice represents another key step in implementing the Commission's 5G FAST Plan. One important component of that plan is making more spectrum available for 5G. And today, we adopt procedures to auction licenses in an important piece of mid-band spectrum for next-generation wireless technologies. Now, it's worth noting that when the Commission began its effort to open up the 3.5 gigahertz band for commercial use in 2012, it wasn't about 5G at all. Instead, it was more of an experiment in spectrum policy. The 3.5 gigahertz band was known as a federal radar band, but federal agencies made little use of this band across much of the country. So the FCC decided to create a dynamic, 3-tiered hierarchical framework to coordinate shared federal and non-federal uses. There were many positive aspects of this framework, but unfortunately, the rules that the Commission adopted under the prior administration didn't do enough to encourage investment and innovation in the 3.5 gigahertz band. When I became chairman, I knew that we had to change this, particularly to encourage 5G deployment in the band. And led by Commissioner O'Reilly, that's exactly what we did. We finished our review in 2018 and made targeted changes to our rules to make 3.5 gigahertz licenses much more appealing for 5G deployment. In particular, we extended the term of priority access licenses from 3 years to 10 years, created a license renewal expectancy, and expanded the geographic size of licenses from census tracts to counties. Now, these reforms will encourage the rapid deployment of next-generation wireless networks in the band. Last year, we took another important step toward commercial use of the 3.5 gigahertz band by authorizing several spectrum access systems applicants to begin initial commercial deployments in the band. And we achieved other important milestones, such as approving 2 environmental sensing capability applications, certifying end-user equipment so that consumers will be able to access the band, and seeking comment on auction procedures. And just last month, we certified several SASs, paving the way for full commercial operations in this band. And today, we have reached another important milestone. We're adopting procedures to auction PALs in the 3.5 gigahertz band. In this auction, which will begin on June 25th, 2020, the FCC will offer over 22,000 licenses, the most ever offered in a single auction. It's an impressive testament to the speed of technological development in the wireless sector that 5G was barely on the radar when the Commission began reimagining the way we use this band. But now, because the FCC has made necessary mid-course corrections to reflect changes in the marketplace, the 3.5 gigahertz auction will help make this band a primary avenue for deploying 5G services. Now, getting to this point wasn't easy, But that we got here is due in significant part to Commissioner Mike O'Reilly. I asked him to lead this effort as the Commission's point person on the 3.5 gigahertz band, and he really delivered, and I thank him for that. I'm also so grateful to the Commission staff who have labored long on this effort. From the Office of Economics and Analytics, the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, the Office of General Counsel, the Office of Managing Director, and the Office of Communications Business Opportunities. We really appreciate the work that you've put in for a long time to get us to this point. This item has my full support. With that, we'll proceed to a vote. Commissioner O'Reilly?
Aye.
Commissioner Carr?
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel?
Approve.
Commissioner Starks?
Approve.
The chair votes to approve as well. The item is adopted. The juror privilege is granted as requested. Thanks, folks, for the great work. Madam Secretary, could you please take us to the next item on today's agenda?
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, the fourth item is entitled Unlicensed White Space Device Operations in the Television Bands. The item will be presented by the Office of Engineering and Technology, and Ron Rapasi, Acting Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Lean and mean, Mr. Rapasi. The floor is yours whenever you and your folks are ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. OET is pleased to present for your consideration a notice of proposed rulemaking that would expand opportunities for unlicensed white space devices operating in unused portions of the broadcast TV bands. Since the Commission first adopted rules for white spaces devices, the unique properties of this spectrum have provided for delivery of broadband services, especially to rural and unserved areas. The notice proposes a number of technical changes designed to improve delivery of broadband service to these areas and provide new opportunities to deliver Internet of Things applications. With me at the table are Paul Murray, Associate Chief in OET, and Hugh Van Tile, who is our Senior Engineer in OET, who has been actively involved in TV white spaces since its inception. Hugh will present the item.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. The item before you is a notice of proposed rulemaking that offers several proposals to expand opportunities for unlicensed white space devices operating in the television broadcast bands to provide affordable broadband service that can help close the digital divide for Americans in rural and underserved areas. This region of the spectrum has excellent propagation characteristics that make it particularly attractive for delivering communication services over long distances. Unlicensed white space devices can be used to provide a variety of wireless services. Fixed white space devices are being deployed today by wireless internet service providers to provide internet connectivity in rural and underserved areas, including for schools and libraries. The notice proposes to increase the maximum power and antenna height for fixed white space devices to provide broadband coverage at greater distances. It would increase the maximum permissible radiated power for devices operating in rural areas in the TV bands from 10 watts to 16 watts. The notice also proposes to increase the maximum permissible antenna height above average terrain for fixed white space devices from 250 meters to 500 meters, subject to a coordination procedure with TV broadcasters. These proposed power and antenna height increases would be paired with correspondingly larger separation distances between protected services in the TV bands and white space devices. These services include TV stations, cable head ends, translator receive sites, the land mobile radio service, and licensed wireless microphones. The notice proposes to allow higher power mobile operations within defined geo-fenced areas. The geolocation capability of these mobile devices, combined with database access, would ensure that they do not cause harmful interference to protected services in the TV bands. The notice also proposes rules for narrowband white space devices that can be used in new and innovative IoT applications. Finally, the notice seeks comment on whether to allow white space devices to operate with higher power levels when located inside an adjacent TV channel service contour, and on the measures that would need to be taken to prevent harmful interference to TV service. These proposals continue our ongoing efforts to spur continued growth of the white space device ecosystem so that the benefits of broadband communications can be enjoyed by all Americans. The staff recommends adoption of this item and requests editorial privileges solely for technical and conforming edits.
Thank you for your presentation. We'll now turn to comments from the bench, beginning with Commissioner O'Reilly.
I thank the chair. This item represents a longtime labor of love for me, as I've advocated for the efficient use of TV white spaces since the mid-2000s. The flexibility reflected in today's notice will help bring further wireless operations and successful deployments to this band. As most people already know, the very nature of television broadcast signals necessitates that frequencies remain fallow so that one full power station does not interfere with another nearby. Additionally, there are some portions of the country, rural areas in particular, where not all channels are being used, even after the station repack following the broadcast incentive auction. It is common sense to make these frequencies available for additional non-interfering wireless services, including those that bring broadband access to unserved households. Some have claimed that white spaces never lived up to the previous hype and disparaged flaws in the first generation of the database. However, now that we are getting to the point post-incentive auction, there is more certainty about spectrum availability. That criticism is no longer compelling. We are finally in a position where interested parties can determine whether there is usable spectrum in a specific area, providing them with the needed assurances to invest and deploy systems. And improvements have been made to ensure the accuracy of the databases. While the Commission took steps to approve additional flexibility to whitespace providers by increasing antenna height and made rule tweaks to increase the reliability of device location information in the database almost a year ago, the record that developed also included other ideas that can be implemented to maximize the potential of these frequencies. That is why I'm so pleased to have led the effort to secure the commitments to bring this NPRM forward. I thank Microsoft for submitting the official petition for rulemaking that serves as the foundation of today's item. The recommendations provided, which include further increases to power limits in rural areas, additional antenna height modifications, and flexibility to provide narrowband IoT, will be particularly useful in providing service in the more remote and unserved parts of the country and allow for a wide variety of use cases. Although there are remaining TV whitespace issues to be resolved, such as facilitating unlicensed use in Channel 37, I applaud the fact that we are addressing the less controversial items and issues here today. I thank the Chair for moving this important item and look forward to an order in the coming months. In a future proceeding, it is imperative that the Commission further explore the opportunities in Channel 37 and the means to relocate the wireless medical services to a more suitable location. I thank the Chair, and I will approve.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Carr.
Thank you. A couple of bumpy hours outside Nairobi, Kenya, sits a small market town called Embu. That's where I met Paul, a young man selling rice, beans, and other dry goods out of a packed market stall. Embu runs along the foothills of Mount Kenya, and like many remote parts of the world, it had been stuck on the wrong side of the digital divide for far too long. That only made it harder for Paul to maintain his business and earn some money, but that changed a few weeks before we met. That's when a fixed wireless provider, Mawingu Networks, worked with Microsoft and another Paul Garnett, to bring internet service to the area using unlicensed TV whitespaces. In Embu, Paul is an entrepreneur at heart, so he immediately seized the opportunity to use whitespace technology to expand his business. He started accepting mobile payments, which were safer and more reliable than cash. He was selling airtime on the network. He was even tweeting out marketing pitches, which I appreciated. That was 1 year ago. I had the chance to reconnect with Paul online this week. I mentioned that I wanted to tell his story at our FCC meeting. He said, "I want you to let people know how an internet connection is changing my life." He now gets 50 customers per day that pay through mobile payments, and the number's increasing every month. And it was clear from our discussion that it's not just his life that benefited from the connection. His shop is now a hotspot that lets other people get online. And a few months ago, he introduced M-Pesa, a mobile money transfer service, which allows customers to withdraw cash at his shop and then purchase goods from other merchants in the market. Paul's story is an example of the power of connectivity. He started out selling dry goods in a market stall with a drive to do even more. Now he runs an internet-powered mobile payment business that provides his entire community with a safe and accessible place to deposit and withdraw money. Now, the combination of broad, low-band coverage and affordable TV whitespace devices help bring this opportunity to MBU. And that's precisely why it's so important that we expand opportunities for whitespace devices in this country. We can make even more progress towards closing the digital divide, connecting IoT devices, while empowering rural communities through high-speed connections. A big reason we're here today is because stakeholders got together, they compromised, and they found a path forward. So I want to commend them for their work, and I look forward to reviewing the feedback that we get on their proposals. I want to thank the Office of Engineering Technology for its work on the item. I appreciate it, has my support.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Remember 2008? The iPhone was 6 months old, the Android operating system was just introduced, and the digital television transition had yet to begin. But a new wireless era was emerging because the same old ways of thinking about scarcity in our airwaves were giving way to new theories of abundance. And nowhere was this clearer at this agency than in our early embrace of white spaces. Because in 2008, the Federal Communications Commission proposed something radical. We suggested that instead of letting unused portions of traditional television spectrum lay fallow, we would open them up for unlicensed use. Not everyone embraced this idea from the start. Mixing broadcast and broadband was not for the faint of heart. But the engineers at this agency saw the value proposition in introducing unlicensed service to a band with significant propagation. They understood from the get-go that these unused airwaves could help bring more broadband to rural and hard-to-reach communities. They could help close the digital divide. So here we are 12 years hence, and we're still working on what was visionary back in 2008. Although white spaces innovation began here in the United States, it's actually advanced more rapidly abroad. 11 countries now have rules permitting television white spaces devices to use broadcast spectrum to help put more broadband in reach. 14 countries have active trials and pilot projects. But here at home, deployment of this technology has stalled. So we need to get our mojo back, and the good news is that this rulemaking is part of that effort. In it, we propose updating our Part 15 rules to provide more flexibility for television white space devices in the United States. To this end, today's rulemaking proposes increasing the maximum power that white space devices can use and extending the height of their antennas. These technical changes can open up new possibilities for using these airwaves to power the Internet of Things and extend the reach of broadband networks. So this is progress. And thank you to those, including broadcasters, who helped develop the ideas we introduce in this rulemaking. But more work needs to be done to address remaining regulatory barriers. By my count, we have 5 outstanding petitions for reconsideration involving white space development and deployment. We also need to clear up unresolved matters regarding designation of a database administrator. And I look forward to doing this, and the sooner the better. Because the ideas we had in 2008 are still worth pursuing, because by using white spaces, we can put more of our airwaves to use for all.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Starks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Deploying high-speed broadband services through rural America has been a major challenge for some time. I support this item because it proposes actions that, if adopted, would increase our options for ensuring the availability of broadband data and other services throughout rural America. Operating in the unused white space between TV stations presents a valuable opportunity that could significantly change the wireless communications landscape. Technologies and devices being developed for use in this spectrum hold the promise of increasing our broadband capacity and our ability to use limited spectrum resources more efficiently and more effectively. Devices that operate in unlicensed white spaces in the TV bands take advantage of the better propagation characteristics of lower band frequencies to enable broadband data and other services in rural and hard-to-reach areas. Last year, the Commission took steps to enable more white space device use by adopting measures to improve the accuracy and reliability of data necessary to determine available spectrum for fixed device use, thereby minimizing interference with protected services operating in the TV bands. We also modified the white space device antenna height rules to allow improved broadband coverage in rural areas. Today's action seeks to build on those good improvements by seeking comment on thoughtful industry proposals that could further increase options for unlicensed white space devices to operate in a manner that better serves unmet broadband coverage needs and without causing undue interference to those broadcasters and other protected users using the same spectrum. This item does pose the right question, seeking comment on how best to protect other operators in TV bands and proposing measures such as increased exclusion zone distances to protect against harmful interference. I do look forward to reviewing the developing record, and thank you to the office for their preparation of this good item.
Thank you, Commissioner. Beatles fans know well the White Album, which included songs that were inspired by the band's journey 52 years ago, this month, to a remote ashram in the rugged foothills of the Himalayas. Perhaps inspired a bit by their creative example, we today launch a proceeding named for the empty white spaces in the spectrum bands allocated to broadcast television. And our hope is that we will similarly enable a revolution, so to speak, this time one of connectivity across rural and remote areas of this country. To understand why this proceeding holds that kind of promise, it's important to recognize the challenge of bridging the digital divide in rural and remote areas. In places that often have sparse populations or rugged terrain, it can be difficult and or expensive to deliver high-speed internet, including wireless broadband. But enabling unlicensed use of TV white spaces, the channels in the television spectrum bands where there are no television stations, can be a game changer. And that's because, as we have heard, these white spaces are in a region of spectrum that is particularly attractive for delivering services over long distances and coping with variations in terrain. These airwaves are thus well suited for delivering broadband to American consumers in rural and remote areas. Moreover, because white space devices operate under our unlicensed rules, the barriers to entry are low, enabling anyone with a compliant device who follows the relevant Commission rules to unlock the potential of this spectrum to provide wireless broadband. I saw the promise of white spaces technology in South Boston, a town in rural Virginia, a while ago, where I met Dylan Harris, a student who said getting internet access in his home through a white space device was a game changer for him. Now, over the years, we've done a lot of work to bring this potential to reality. And today, we're advancing proposals that could spur significant growth of the white space ecosystem and extend internet connectivity to many more Americans. We propose to increase the power and antenna height limits for fixed white space devices deployed in less congested areas to improve coverage and decrease costs. We propose to authorize higher power mobile white space device operation within specified geofenced areas to enable the provision of broadband services on school buses and other mobile platforms such as agricultural equipment. And we propose to amend the rules to better accommodate the narrow bandwidths associated with many Internet of Things applications. I'm optimistic that these proposals will expand broadband deployment to rural Americans and also protect television broadcast signals. And I want to commend Microsoft and the National Association of Broadcasters for working together and with us in a cooperative manner to develop them. This kind of cooperation is vital because at the end of the day, television broadcasters enjoy top priority in the TV spectrum bands, and we must not take any action in this proceeding that would end up causing harmful interference to TV broadcasters. Like my colleagues, I'd like to thank the dedicated staff whose contributions to this item were invaluable, including from the Office of Engineering and Technology, the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, the Office of Economics and Analytics, and the Office of General Counsel. Thank you for your work. With that, we'll proceed to a vote. Commissioner O'Reilly?
Aye.
Commissioner Carr?
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel?
Approve.
Commissioner Starks?
Approve.
The chair votes to approve as well. The item is adopted. Editorial privilege is granted as requested. Madam Secretary, could you please take us to the next item on today's agenda?
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, the fifth item is entitled Comment Sought on Competitive Bidding Procedures and Certain Program Requirements for Rural Digital Opportunity Fund Auction. The item will be presented by the Office of Economics and Analytics, the Wireline Competition Bureau, and the Rural Broadband Auctions Task Force, and Michael Jansen, Director of the Rural Broadband Auctions Task Force, will give the introduction.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Mr. Jansen, whenever you are ready, the floor is yours.
Thank you. The Rural Broadband Auctions Task Force, the Office of Economics and Analytics, the Wireline Competition Bureau present a public notice seeking comment on the application and auction procedures to be used in the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund Phase 1 auction. At the table with me are Julia McHenry, Chief of the Office of Economics and Analytics, Chris Monteith, Chief of the Wireline Competition Bureau, Trent Harkrader, Deputy Chief of WCB, Jonathan Campbell, Acting Division Chief of the Auctions Division of OEA, Alex Menard, Deputy Division Chief of the Telecommunications Access Policy Division in WCB, Mark Montano, Attorney Advisor in the Auctions Division in OEA, Heidi Lankow, Attorney Advisor in the Telecommunications Access Policy Division in WCB. Mark will now present the item.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. Today's public notice, if adopted, will seek comment on procedures for implementing the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund Phase 1 auction, the Commission's largest step so far towards bridging the digital divide. The Phase 1 auction, which we call Auction 904, will award up to $16 billion over 10 years to support the deployment of fixed voice and broadband service to homes and businesses and communities that lack access to at least 25.3 megabits per second. It will be the second auction to award ongoing high-cost universal service support through competitive bidding in a multi-round reverse auction following the successful Connect America Fund Phase 2 auction, or Auction 903, in 2018. Many of the proposed procedures in the public notice are the same as those the Commission adopted for Auction 903. The public notice also proposes some new or revised procedures in an effort to improve upon Auction 903. We currently expect bidding to start on October 22, 2020. First, the public notice will seek comment on the appropriate minimum geographic area for bidding. Auction 903 used census block groups, but we expect a far larger number of census block groups to be eligible in this auction. Second, the public notice will seek comment on procedures for collecting information in the pre-auction short-form application. The short-form application would be used by Commission staff to determine whether a potential bidder has the legal, technical, and financial qualifications to participate in the auction. The information we propose to be disclosed will be reviewed to assess an applicant's qualifications to place bids to provide service at the performance tier and latency combinations selected by the applicant. In addition, to protect the integrity of the auction, the public notice proposes to prohibit commonly controlled entities from filing more than one short-form application and to ban joint bidding arrangements between or among applicants. Third, the public notice proposes bidding procedures for a multi-round descending clock auction. To place a bidder would indicate that it is willing to provide service to locations in the eligible census blocks in a biddable area at a specified performance tier and latency for which it is qualified, and at the support amount implied by a certain clock percentage. A bidder would have the option of submitting bids for packages of areas, as well as the ability to submit proxy bids so that the bidder would not have to manually bid in each round. A bidder would be subject to activity requirements and limitations on its ability to switch bids to different areas. The auction would end after the aggregate support amount of all bids is less than or equal to the total budget, and all remaining competition for a particular area is resolved. One of the main differences from Auction 903's bidding procedures is the proposal to implement the order's requirement to prioritize bids with higher performance once the budget has cleared. By awarding funding based on commitments to offer faster speeds and lower latency, these procedures would encourage the deployment of sustainable networks at competitive levels of support. The Office of Economics and Analytics, Wireline Competition Bureau, and the Rural Broadband Auctions Task Force recommend adoption of this public notice and request editorial privileges extending only to technical and conforming edits.
Thank you for the presentation. We'll begin with comments from the bench. Commissioner Early.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The major policy debate over how to structure the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund auction was resolved in last month's report and order. And now the Commission moves on to determining the largely administrative pre-auction and bidding procedures. Any disagreement with respect to that policy cuts in the previous decisions should and therefore be considered separately from this item. Indeed, this very straightforward public notice proposes to adopt many of the same sound processes as in the Commission's successful Connect America Phase 2 auction, and it has my support. While the proposal is not identical in every respect to our previous framework, most of the adjustments are simply intended to address lessons from CAF 2 and implement the new clearing round bid assignment rule. And although the auction bias towards certain technologies over others appears to be a foregone conclusion, I appreciate the addition of clarifying language to the circulated draft to soften the Commission's prejudice in this regard. I commend the staff involved in this item, including the Rural Broadband Auctions Task Force, for their hard work in pushing the auction forward. I look forward to our next steps in implementing the RDOF, especially our release of the initial list of eligible areas and a corresponding challenge process. The latter process is vital to ensuring that our scarce funds are not used to subsidize overbuilding, and I plan to monitor that closely. I thank the Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Carr.
Thank you so much to the team for all the work that you put in. It's going to build, as Commissioner O'Reilly said, on the good work of our last item and really make even more progress on closing the digital divide. So thanks for your work. It has my support.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Last fall, I joined Senator Manchin in West Virginia. We crisscrossed the Mountain State in all of its autumnal glory. And the towns we stopped in were small, all proud of their history and all grappling with their future. Everyone we met expressed concern about how reliable broadband had not yet reached the homes and businesses in their communities. They spoke of the connections they were not able to forge, the economic opportunities that had been lost, and the students who struggled with the homework gap. Their frustration was real. They were also aggrieved that this agency's maps say they have broadband when they know on the ground, at home and at work, they do not. In the fall, I also traveled to upstate New York. Same story. People want to know how they will ever grow a business, sell their home, or see their community thrive when there is no broadband to be found. To add insult to injury, when these Empire State folks looked at Federal Communications Commission data, they found something disturbing. This agency said they have service when they clearly do not. A few weeks later, I ventured to southern New Mexico. I spent time with healthcare providers looking at how telemedicine could improve outcomes in vast rural stretches of the state. But for so many of their patients, broadband is a pipe dream. It's just not there. Again, I was told our maps do not do justice to the lack of service. One of the people I met asked a question that still stings. How will we really fix this problem without first fixing our maps? That question deserves an honest answer. So here it is. 13 days before the election, the FCC will start the largest program for federal broadband funding in our nation's history. But this Rural Digital Opportunity Fund looks more like publicity stunt than policy. That's because we are spending billions of dollars without the facts we need. We have not done a single thing to fix our dubious broadband data or address our inaccurate broadband maps. Those are the maps, remember, that have been panned by Congress, cabinet secretaries, and consumers. They're not accurate. Worse, for everyone who our maps erroneously suggest are served by broadband when they are not, moving ahead here right now means it could be 10 years before this agency is able to offer any further assistance. For too many people in too many places, like the ones I visited in West Virginia, New York, and New Mexico, that means our digital divide will turn into a yawning chasm. This is not right. To do this right, we need maps before money and data before deployment. It's time to work. We need to roll up our sleeves and get the data we do not have about where service is and is not. Then we need to do just what Senator Manchin said in a letter to all of us yesterday. Hold this auction after our maps can be fixed, challenged, and verified. Failure to do that will fail millions of people in our communities across this country who will never see support from this agency, even though they are stuck on the wrong side of the digital divide. To do this right, we also need to acknowledge that we're not going to be able to do it on our own. We need to work with state and local authorities and not fight their efforts to help bring broadband to their communities. But that's not what we do here. In fact, last month, in a batch of last-minute changes, the FCC decided that the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund would not be available in places where states have their own programs. By some counts, that's as many as 30 states. That's crazy, and we have no idea how any of this is going to play out on the ground. We should be encouraging states to work with us, not penalizing them for their efforts to bring broadband to communities that are struggling. We have this exactly backwards. And to do this right, we are also going to need straightforward procedures to facilitate distribution of funds. And on this last point, let me acknowledge the hard work of our agency staff, because this public notice asks the right questions about how to implement this descending clock auction. It's the lone aspect of this effort I find sensible. It's the only part that I support. Universal service is a cherished principle. Fixing the digital divide is at the heart of this agency's mission. But doing it in a haphazard way, where we are distributing billions of dollars without taking care of job one, making sure we have the data to do so, is unacceptable. So in all other aspects, I dissent.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Starks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When we voted on the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund just last month, I raised a number of concerns. Two of the most important were, one, that we were continuing to distribute funds based upon deeply flawed Form 477 data, and second, that we have adopted a confusing and confused counterproductive approach toward coordinating RDOF with state funds. Just last week, I visited Senator McEachin's district in Richmond, also with Congresswoman Spamberger, and there we heard directly from Americans about how they were also confused about how the Virginia State Broadband Program was going to be impacted by what we are doing here today. I won't repeat a lot of those concerns, but I do want to underscore that we do not have to let these problems stand. We do have options. Nearly 24 members of Congress have asked us to give the states an opportunity to comment on the portions of our January decision that impact state programs and reconsider that decision. And as you just heard from my colleague just yesterday, Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia sent a letter urging us to revise the aggressive timeline for RDOF until after the eligibility maps can be challenged and verified. I believe that fiscal responsibility, prudence, and the law all requires us to heed those calls. And while I approve the auction mechanism the FCC adopts here today, I cannot support pressing ahead towards an artificial deadline with such significant concerns deeply unresolved. And for that reason, I dissent with the remainder of the item, including the auction timeline.
Thank you, Commissioner. If you fly for several hours and drive for several hours more, you can visit Ithidi, Wyoming. It's a tiny town in the remote reaches of the Wind River Reservation. I visited Ithidi earlier this month. It was pretty cold there, but I got a warm welcome from Patrick Lawson, who runs Wind River Internet, a tribally owned broadband provider. He described some of the challenges and opportunities of connecting tribal members with broadband. I also met Tara and Marcus. They were busy connecting homes with gigabit-capable fiber offered by Wind River Internet. But they took time to share with me how the work they did gave them a sense of purpose, in addition to being a good job. And I met tribal leaders who told me what a big difference this connectivity would make, from enabling tribal members to apply for jobs to allowing kids to learn about their culture. The linchpin to this brighter future was the FCC. The digital opportunity being delivered on the Wind River Reservation was made possible in substantial part by the FCC's Connect America Fund Phase 2 auction. For showing me what's being accomplished in the middle of winter in some of the most sparsely populated, challenging terrain in the country, I want to say, ho hinonai, the wutaneni tano'o. Thank you to the Northern Arapaho tribe. And I'll keep practicing the Arapaho that you taught me. What's true in Wyoming is true everywhere else in rural America. Whether starting a business, furthering their educations, seeking high-quality healthcare, or simply connecting with loved ones around the world, rural consumers need and deserve the same access to high-speed, dependable broadband as their counterparts in urban areas. And that's why we're acting decisively with Phase 1 of the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund auction. We're building on the success of the CAF 2 auction to bring broadband to as many as 6 million unserved homes and rural businesses that we know for a fact lack broadband and are unlikely to get it anytime soon without help. Today's item takes the next step in that process, seeking public input on a variety of proposals regarding the processes that will govern the auction, which is slated to begin in October. Now, fair warning, many of the proposals we are making today may seem rather technical and complicated, but they're essential to ensuring a competitive, fair, and efficient auction. This public notice will make sure that our limited Universal Service Fund dollars bring the fastest broadband networks possible to as many Americans as we can. It'll help determine everything from which service providers can participate and the way bidding in the auction will be conducted, to how the Commission will award support to bidders and vet them to ensure that they can deliver the services promised to their customers. I look forward to reviewing stakeholders' comments as we move forward to finalize the auction procedures and kick off the bidding this fall. I'd like to thank the many terrific staff throughout this building that contributed to this item, including from the Office of Economics and Analytics, the Rural Broadband Auctions Task Force, the Wireline Competition Bureau, the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, the Office of Communications Business Opportunities, the Office of General Counsel, the International Bureau, and the Office of Native Affairs and Policy for the great work. It has my full support. With that, we'll proceed to a vote. Commissioner O'Reilly?
Aye.
Commissioner Carr?
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel?
Approve in part, dissent in part.
Commissioner Starks?
Approve in part, dissent in part.
And I vote to approve as well. The item is adopted with the editorial privileges granted as requested. Thanks to all of you for the great work. Madam Secretary, to item number 6 we go.
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, the sixth item is entitled Amendment of Commission Rule Requiring Records of Cable Operator Interest in Video Programming, Modernization of Media Regulation Initiative. The item will be presented by the Media Bureau, and Michelle Carey, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Ms. Carey, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. The Media Bureau is pleased to present a notice of proposed rulemaking that advances the Commission's efforts to modernize its media regulations and eliminate outdated or unnecessary requirements. This is the Commission's 20th proceeding as part of its Media Modernization Initiative. Joining me at the table are Ty Bream and Chad Go of the Media Bureau. Chad will present the item.
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, we present to you this NPRM, which seeks comment on whether to modify or eliminate the requirement that cable operators maintain records in their online public inspection files regarding their interests in video programming services, as well as their carriage of such services on cable systems which they own. Comments in the Commission's Modernization of Media Regulation Initiative identified this requirement as an element that should be eliminated from cable operators' online public inspection files. The original purpose of this requirement was to aid in compliance with the Commission's channel occupancy limits, which were reversed and remanded by the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit in 2001. Therefore, the NPRM seeks comment on whether there is any remaining purpose for this related record-keeping rule. The NPRM seeks comment on other potential sources of similar video program information and whether alternative sources would be adequate substitutes for the information currently provided by cable operators. The NPRM also seeks comment on other methods of disclosing this information that would be more efficient or less burdensome on cable operators than maintaining it in the online public inspection file. Lastly, the NPRM seeks comment on the current regulatory burden for cable operators to file this information and whether the burdens and costs outweigh the utility of the information. The Media Bureau recommends that the Commission adopt this notice of proposed rulemaking and requests editorial privileges to make any necessary technical or conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Go, for your presentation. We'll now turn to comments from the bench. Commissioner O'Reilly.
I thank the chair. Fans of HGTV are familiar with the likely fate of ugly wallpaper left behind when the original owners vacate an outdated home. Similarly, today, we take the first step of ripping out a reporting requirement that has faded from relevance in the 2 decades since the Commission's cable occupancy limits were reversed and remanded by the D.C. Circuit. As noted in the item, this reporting requirement was moved to a different subsection within our Part 76 rules for administrative efficiency before the turn of the century. While generally overlooked during subsequent regulatory cleanup efforts as a result, it has remained an ugly, a slightly fixture for cable operators ever since. It is telling that no one thus far has argued in favor of keeping this reporting requirement, nor justified any apparent use for the collected information. Let that sink in for any critics. Not a single soul has advocated so far that we maintain this rule. Nonetheless, the item explores potential reasonable arguments that can be made in its favor should the information still have utility in a different context. At the same time, we make clear that even if the information is determined to be useful, we must consider more efficient ways to obtain it, rather than simply requiring cable operators to stockpile it by default. Personally, I seriously doubt the information is useful or that it could not be more easily obtained another way. As I've noted in the past, continuing to collect this information when the original purpose for doing so has been struck down by the courts is a serious waste of time and resources for everyone. It is time to move on. I thank the chairman and staff for carrying out my idea to jettison this rule, considering my input when crafting the proposal and bringing this item to a vote. I look forward to a speedy resolution culminating in a final order. While plenty of work remains on our media modernization efforts, we're making progress each month and need to keep up the momentum. I will approve.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Carr.
Thank you very much to the staff for your work on the item. I appreciate it. It has my support.
Thanks, Commissioner. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Today, we kick off another rulemaking to modernize our media policies. We ask about changing our rules regarding cable operators and whether or not they have to maintain records in their public files about their interests in video programming services. This seems kind of simple, but there's a procedural quirk here that makes this more complicated than it first seems. So let me explain. For decades, the FCC has required that broadcasters, cable operators, and direct broadcast satellite providers keep public inspection files that include a range of information about their operations. The specific records cable operators are required to keep that are at issue here are a byproduct of a law known as the Cable Television Consumer Protection and Competition Act of 1992. Now, in that law, Congress directed this agency to establish limits on the number of channels a cable operator may devote to video programming from affiliated channels. Our first such rules were put in place in 1993. They were revised in 1999. But in 2001, a court remanded those limits back to the agency. A series of rulemakings followed, including one in 2008, when this agency last asked, in light of the remand, how it should refashion these rules. And then, nothing. Until today, when we ask for comment on getting rid of the filings required pursuant to the very rule for which a rulemaking is still outstanding. You might think something here is missing, and you would be right. We need to address the underlying remand, and we should be doing it before we seek comment on removing the records associated with this rule regarding video programming services. This is sloppy legal work. It puts the cart before the horse. We have time to fix the underlying issues here before we proceed, and I'd hope we do. And for this reason, I'm going to choose to concur. This latest installment in our media modernization initiative suggests we are looking high and low for rules to rescind. But the truth is we are avoiding the most obvious places. Among the most obvious? Well, it's an election year. Those online public files kept by broadcasters, cable operators, and direct broadcast satellite providers include what is known as the political file. It features a treasure trove of information about who paid for political advertisements, when they ran, and what issues of national importance they discuss. This is an essential tool for transparency in elections. An estimated $4.55 billion is expected to be spent just on television advertising during this election cycle. So you might want to see where it's going and who is funding candidates. But good luck, because this agency dedicated to the digital age has chosen to leave those files locked away in analog format. That means it's impossible for the public to use this file to serve as a tool for journalists, researchers, advocates, any one of us who wants to find out what's going on. It's time to fix this mess and modernize these files by making them machine readable. Today's rulemaking, however, does nothing to address this problem, and that's unfortunate because it is the kind of media modernization our democracy needs.
Commissioner Starks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree that as a matter of good stewardship, the Commission should update and eliminate rules found to be clearly obsolete or unnecessary. Here, the Commission seeks comment on whether to eliminate or modify Section 76.1710 of our rules, which requires cable providers to maintain records in their online public inspection files regarding the nature and extent of their attributable interests in video programming services, and the extent to which they carry services on cable systems in which they have an attributable interest. And at first blush, this seems to be a narrow inquiry about a reporting requirement that may be inconsequential, but a closer examination reveals that more is at stake. Let me begin by repeating the standard that I have set out at the very first one of these that I saw, these media modernization regulation items, with the consistent framework that I apply. I've stated that no matter how narrow the proceeding or how minor the form or rule being eliminated, I will look into each item further to make sure that the Commission is meeting its broader statutory obligations and key mission. This is to ensure that when we propose to eliminate a rule or regulation, the Commission's underlying statutory obligations are otherwise being addressed, or we make a commitment to address any unmet requirements under the law. In the instance of unmet statutory obligations, we should always seek concrete steps to make progress towards compliance with the law, make a firm plan to engage, or in short order, demonstrate our commitment to meeting our obligations. I first articulated this approach nearly a year ago when we considered elimination of the requirement that certain broadcasters file midterm equal employment opportunity EEO data on Form 397. I concurred with that action because I believed we did not adequately face our statutory obligation to ensure that broadcasters are seeking and attracting diverse employees. I engaged with the Chairman's office and the Media Bureau, proposing a clear path forward to resolve that underlying rulemaking that had been pending for 15 years. And although I was able to get a commitment to issue a further notice on our EEO rules more generally, the resulting notice of those proposed rulemakings released in July of 2019 was disappointing and inadequate to fully address the Commission's failure to comply with this statutory duty for EEO data. I do remain hopeful that the record from that proceeding will continue and will produce enough of a groundswell to compel us to finally and comprehensively fix our EEO data collection regime. That brings us to today, where I feel like it is deja vu all over again. We are considering the elimination of a reporting rule, but in seeking to eliminate that rule, we are leaving unaddressed the statutory obligations that require the Commission to prescribe a reasonable limit on the number of video programming channels on a cable system that can be occupied by a cable operator's own channels. Congress apparently concerned that cable operators might favor their own affiliate video programmers over others or otherwise impede consumer access to video programming, adopted this requirement to enhance effective competition. The reporting rule at issue here today was at one time deemed necessary for the Commission and others to monitor compliance with the underlying channel occupancy limit rule. It is now targeted for elimination as outdated, in part because the underlying rule was reversed and remanded over 18 years ago, but this reporting requirement does not stand alone. It is bound to the underlying statutory requirement, which has its roots in Congress's directives. We could argue that with so much video content out there from DBS and other MVPD providers, online video distributors, streaming apps, it is well established enough to no longer need reporting on this metric. But without revisiting the channel occupancy limit itself, how can we reasonably reach that conclusion? And so, as I've said before, true regulatory modernization means more than simply getting rid of rules. If we make decisions while leaving basic and foundational statutory obligations unmet, the rules and policies that are in need of modernization will be unchanged or forgotten. And this is in true case here on the channel occupancy limit rule, which has languished in a state of repeal without replacement for only 18 years. In this instance, our modernization seems more like sweeping under the rug. I think it sends the wrong signal to move forward on eliminating the reporting requirement without addressing the underlying statutory requirement, and for that reason, I will only concur.
Thank you, Commissioner. As we have heard, in 2001, the D.C. Circuit remanded the Commission's cable channel occupancy rules, which restricted the number of channels that could be occupied on cable systems by video programmers in which the cable operator had an attributable interest. In order to help enforce those limits, the Commission established a record-keeping rule requiring cable operators to maintain in their public inspection files records regarding their carriage of any vertically integrated video programming. Now, over the last 19 years, the FCC, under 7 different chairs, 4 Democrats and 3 Republicans, has declined to revisit the issue of channel occupancy limits. Yet this record-keeping requirement has remained on the books. And so, at Commissioner O'Reilly's suggestion, this notice of proposed rulemaking principally tees up a very simple question. Does this rule continue to serve any useful purpose? We seek comment on whether this reporting requirement is still necessary and ask about the usefulness of the information collected versus the costs associated with compiling it. For its efforts on this 20th proceeding in the Media Modernization Regulation Initiative, I'd like to thank the Commission staff that worked on this item from the Media Bureau and the Office of General Counsel. It has my full support. With that, we'll move to a vote. Commissioner O'Reilly?
Aye.
Commissioner Carr?
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel?
Concur.
Commissioner Starks?
Concur.
And the chair votes to approve as well. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Thanks, folks. Madam Secretary, could you please take us to the next item on today's agenda?
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, the 7th and final item on your agenda will be presented by the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau and is entitled Amendments to Part 4 of the Commission's Rules Concerning Disruptions to Communications, Petition of California Public Utilities Commission and the People of the State of California for rulemaking on states' access to the Network Outage Reporting System, or NORS, and a ruling granting California access to NORS. Lisa Folks, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
Thank you very much. And Ms. Folks, if you are ready, the floor is yours.
I'm always ready. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. When disasters strike, state and federal agencies play a crucial role in supporting the restoration of communication services. We have seen this in the response to hurricanes in the Atlantic, wildfires in California, and most recently, earthquakes in Puerto Rico. In doing so, these agencies must make decisions from the field, such as how to allocate personnel and resources. Accurate and timely information about the status of communication services and infrastructure can help these agencies in making those decisions, but this information is often difficult for them to acquire. Fortunately, the FCC collects communications outage and infrastructure status information in 2 systems, the Network Outage Reporting System and the Disaster Information Reporting System. The second further notice of proposed rulemaking we present today proposes a framework for the FCC to provide state and federal agencies with access to this information to improve their situational awareness, enhance their ability to respond more quickly to outages affecting their communities, and to help save lives while also preserving the confidentiality of this information. With me at the table from the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau are Nicole McGinnis, Deputy Bureau Chief, Austin Randazzo, Chief of the Cybersecurity and Communications Reliability Division, Brenda Villanueva, an attorney advisor in the division, and Saswaf Mizra, also an attorney advisor in the division. I would like to thank the other bureaus and offices that contributed to this item. And on a personal note, I would like to give a shout out to the men and women of the FCC's Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau for their hard work and dedication to this great nation. My team's commitment to public safety is fierce, and they have my utmost gratitude and respect for everything they do every day, and yes, including Saturday and Sunday, to ensure that the public's safety is job number 1. Ms. Villanueva will present the item.
Thank you, Chief Folks. Good afternoon, Chairman Pai and Commissioners. Communication service providers file information about their operational status in the FCC's Network Outage Reporting System and during disasters in our Disaster Information Reporting System. Given the sensitive nature of this data to both national security and commercial competitiveness, the FCC treats this data as presumptively confidential. Today's second further notice proposes a framework for the FCC to share this information with agencies of the federal government, the 50 states, Washington, D.C., the tribal nations, and U.S. territories that reasonably require access to the information in order to prepare for or respond to an event that threatens public safety. Specifically, the notice proposes that a limited number of trained employees of participating agencies be granted read-only access to the filings in these systems that concern their jurisdiction. Participating agencies would be permitted to share the information with government officials, first responders, and others who cannot directly access the filings, yet play a vital public safety role in their respective jurisdictions. These agencies would also be permitted to release this information to the public when the information is aggregated and anonymized across at least 4 service providers. And to protect the information filed with the FCC, the notice proposes an application process that requires agencies to certify to certain requirements for maintaining the confidentiality of the data and the security of the systems. Specifically, a participating agency would be required to treat the filings as confidential and not disclose the information absent a finding by the Commission that allows the agency to do so. A participating agency would also be required to complete security training and report suspected breaches of protocol to the FCC. And further, the agency would be required to notify the Commission whenever it receives an open records request for confidential information for these systems, or when its open records laws change to no longer allow the agency to protect the information in accordance to our requirements. The Bureau recommends adoption of the second further notice of proposed rulemaking and requests editorial privileges for technical and conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. We'll now turn to comments from the bench, beginning with Commissioner O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll submit my statement for the record, but to say I thank the chair for being so receptive in fixing a couple flaws with this original version that was circulated and for improving the item going forward, and we'll see where the comments take us. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Carr.
Thanks. I do have a statement and had a video as well that I will spare you all from. I know you love those. But I just want to say thank you so much for your work on the item. It is proposals that I think can make a really good difference, particularly in those immediate hours and days after natural disasters happen when we need to have a lot of information on what's happening on the ground. So thanks for your work on the item.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
All right. Thanks, Brenda. After Superstorm Sandy ravaged the Mid-Atlantic, I traveled to the New Jersey coast, and I won't ever forget what I saw. The storm surge had propelled sand dunes blocks beyond the beachfront, with a cruel disregard for the houses and cars that were in the way. Streets were torn up, businesses were boarded up, but so many of those communities, they were not giving up. They wanted to rebuild. Still, the task was hard because in so many places, communications were totally knocked out after the storm. After the Oso mudslide washed away a rural community in Washington state, I visited the site of the disaster, and it was harrowing. There was only a field of wet dirt laced with broken building materials and the household detritus of a community that had totally disappeared. It happened fast. Calls to 911 went unanswered, communications faltered, and 43 people died trapped in a towering wall of mud. Now, after Hurricane Maria wreaked havoc on Puerto Rico, I headed south to San Juan and then inland to the rural communities on the island. Now, Puerto Rico is undeniably lush and beautiful, but the damage was right there, out in the open for all to see. Tarps covered buildings, traffic lights didn't work, and stray blocks of concrete and rebar were everywhere. Across the island, communications totally failed, with more than 95% of cell sites knocked out of service. Now, in events like these, the Federal Communications Commission activates the Disaster Information Recovery System, or DIRS. And DIRS is a reporting system used by communications providers to update the FCC about the operational status of their networks in disaster. It's a voluntary system, but it is designed to work hand in glove with our mandatory Network Outage Reporting System, or NORS, so that we have a clear picture of what outages occurred, when they occurred, and where they occurred. During the last 10 years, DIRS has been activated for communications failures in at least 23 states and territories. And that last decade is important because it was 10 years ago that the California Public Utilities Commission petitioned this agency to help provide state authorities with timely access to outage information, just like what we have in DIRS. The FCC asked for comment. It was 5 years ago that this agency issued a rulemaking that proposed to grant state officials access to NORS data regarding outages in their states. Again, the FCC asked for comment. That means we have a decade of experience with disasters. We also have a decade-long record with comments about just how to relay outage information to our state colleagues. So let me submit that we don't need another rulemaking. We just need to do something. Unfortunately, you won't find that urgency here because we're going to start yet another rulemaking on what is totally obvious. We have a problem with communications failing in disasters, and we should change our rules so state public safety officials have the information from our outage reporting systems that they need to do their job. We could do that right here and now. There's nothing in the law preventing us from adopting the policies we propose today in this rulemaking. The evidence is already there. In too many disasters, communications fail. It's happening in hurricanes, it's happening in floods, it's happening in wildfires, it's happening everywhere. And everywhere across the country, the number of households that rely on wireless-only service are multiplying. That has long-term implications for our network safety, security, and resiliency. So it's time for this agency to stop these modest gestures and fundamentally refresh our playbook for disaster. Here's how. First, we need to make it standard practice for the FCC to learn from every major communication outage. Every significant weather event causing damage to our network should be the subject of a timely report from the FCC. It should be supported by timely field hearings, as was done by this agency immediately after Hurricane Katrina and Superstorm Sandy. Second, we need to update our wireless resiliency framework. The Government Accountability Office has criticized the FCC for its failure to promote network resiliency, and it's urged us to do more. In response, this agency has sought comment, count them, 4 times about how we should do so. Enough seeking comment. It's time to take action. We need enforceable rules on network resiliency before the next disaster strikes. Third, we need to update the outage information that the FCC collects. It's hard to believe, but while the FCC collects information about outages on telephone lines, it does not collect information about disruptions involving broadband service. That means if the infrastructure that supports modern life goes down, the FCC does not have a full picture of the problem. How is it possible that we are the expert agency with responsibility for our nation's communications, but do not have a mandatory requirement that we get reports about where broadband service is and is not? A proposal to address this gap in our reporting system has been pending for 4 years. It's time to take action. Fourth, we need to revisit our policies when it comes to backup power. When utilities in California turned off power to mitigate wildfires, it exposed a glaring weakness in our preparation for disaster. In some areas, more than half the cell sites were rendered inoperable. We need to rethink our policies about backup power, and while we're at it, we need to recognize that the topology of our network is changing. The introduction of small cells means our old ways of tracking the sites that go down and ensuring sustainability, it's growing more complicated. But what's most important is that we get started on all of this now, so our resiliency policies are ready for the 5G future. That's what I think we need. And you know, I'm not alone. There's legislation pending right now in the House of Representatives to strengthen disaster response, including the Resilient Networks Act from Chairman Pallone and Representative McNerney, and the Emergency Reporting Act from Representatives Matsui, Eshoo, Thompson, and Huffman. In the end, we do not need to wait for another Superstorm Sandy, Oso mudslide, or Hurricane Maria to know that we have to do more to ensure our communications work when the unthinkable occurs. We don't need more comment to work with state public safety officials to help restore communications after a disaster. We need action. We can change our rules right here and now. And because we do not, I dissent.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Starks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One of the Commission's primary duties is to promote access to communication services so that all Americans can access and share critical information, especially in support of public safety. Last weekend, I visited Puerto Rico because I wanted to hear directly from Puerto Ricans about the steps taken to improve the resiliency of their communication networks since Hurricanes Irma and Maria, how communication networks and recovery efforts performed during the very recent earthquakes, and what additional actions are needed to ensure that communications networks are always available. I held a field hearing in my capacity as a commissioner, and I am grateful to the many individuals and stakeholders from local government, the labor movement, the healthcare and education sectors, disaster recovery workers, and the communication sector's individuals who shared their on-the-ground experience with me. I heard personal stories of loss and tragedy, about schools that have closed, never to be reopened, about homes that were destroyed and how hard it has been to rebuild. And of course, well beyond mere structures, I heard from people working hard to rebuild their lives that were forever altered by communications failures. Jamie Placortes, the executive president of the Puerto Rico Hospital Association, told me that mental health has been the #1 ongoing medical issue on the island. And most movingly, I heard directly from a volunteer worker who's restoring communications in areas impacted by the earthquakes about her own father, who died after Hurricane Maria because they were unable to call for 911 help to get medical attention. We cannot take away the anxiety and the fear that many Puerto Ricans felt when they could not reach their friends, family, emergency services, and we cannot bring back loved ones who died because help was unreachable. But we can work, of course, to never have that happen again, never to have a communication failure like the one in Puerto Rico. And that's why I'm calling on the FCC to bring the full strength of its resources to still engage with Puerto Rico, engage with stakeholders there to understand what happened to the communication networks on the island and its people, to understand what can be done better, even now. Issue a report about that assessment. The people and frequency of disasters there in Puerto Rico have something to share for the world. For months after Hurricane Maria, critical communications infrastructure remained out of service, making it overwhelmingly difficult for Puerto Ricans to access potentially life-saving information. And I have said, as a former enforcement official, I believe in accountability. And it is imperative that the FCC hold itself accountable for how it responds to both to Hurricane Maria and ongoing disasters. One broader theme I took away from these conversations is the need for fast and effective coordination during an emergency. That includes coordination between ordinary Americans, their government, between companies across levels of government, including among first responders and across industry players. But I heard specifically from Puerto Rican communications providers who also indicated that as important as communication is, it comes with a trade-off. Coordination takes time, and during a disaster, response and time is in short supply. The FCC needs to help make disaster-related coordination predictable, fast, efficient, and effective. Which brings us to today. Giving state and local officials access to the Network Outage Reporting System, NORS, and the Disaster Information Reporting System, DIRS, is a step in the right direction. I believe we do have a sufficient record to move forward, and bringing those officials into the DIRS-NORS system will help minimize duplicative reporting, ensure that different levels of government are working from the same playbook. Securing and maintaining the confidentiality of those systems remains important. But I believe that we can provide adequate protections while still expanding access to life-saving and recovery-enhancing information. As our communication networks have expanded, sometimes we take stable, reliable access to communications and the access, of course, that comes with it to friends, family, emergency services, employment, and all of those benefits for granted. Puerto Rico's experience, especially in light of the hurricanes and the earthquakes, shows that we shouldn't. The next hurricane season is already on its way, and we need to help take action now. Going forward, I think it's time we considered making provider participation in DERS mandatory. In dire circumstances, this information is frequently life-saving. Participation should not be optional. Yesterday, the House Energy and Commerce Committee held a legislative hearing, including on the Resilient Networks Act sponsored by Chairman Pallone, Representative McNerney. And that bill would include, among many other proposals, requiring the FCC to expand access to DERS and make participation for all advanced communication service providers mandatory during times of an emergency. DERS has proven to be a valuable tool in disaster response, and I support those congressional efforts to make it ever more useful. Thank you to the staff for their hard work on this item.
Thank you, Commissioner. Over the last 5 years, the United States has experienced $69 billion disasters, affecting millions of Americans and, in some cases, displacing entire communities. Our experience with these disasters has taught us the importance of knowing the operational status of communications services in an impacted area. That information is critical to developing an effective emergency response, to restoring communications, and to ultimately saving lives. And that's why today we are proposing new rules to enable more public entities to access network outage information collected by the Commission. In this second further notice of proposed rulemaking, we build upon two mechanisms already in place to gather information about the reliability and security of the nation's communications infrastructure: the Network Outage Report System, or NORS, and the Disaster Information Reporting System, or DERS. We already have rules on the books that require communications providers to report network service disruptions or outages by filing electronically in NORS. And in times of crisis, such as hurricanes and earthquakes, communications providers may use DERS to voluntarily report outage information. But here's the concern. Other than the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, federal and state agencies currently do not have direct access to information from NORS or DERS. Instead, they can only review aggregate data, information that is not specific to any company. And as I've heard and seen firsthand in areas like Florida, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands, specific information is essential to help those on the front lines respond to a disaster, whether it's a major hurricane, earthquake, or wildfire. Now, this second further notice of proposed rulemaking would address that gap. It proposes a framework to provide state and federal agencies, including tribal entities, with access to granular and actionable outage information contained in NORS and DERS. And at the same time, we're also proposing several safeguards to preserve the presumptively confidential treatment of NORS and DERS data and protect national security. For example, we sensibly propose that only officials who demonstrate a need to know may have access to such information, and that access to these filings be permitted in only a read-only format. I would like to join Chief Folks in saluting the FCC staff that worked on this item, from the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau, the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau, the Enforcement Bureau, the Office of Economics and Analytics, the Office of General Counsel, the Office of Communications Business Opportunities, the Wireline Competition Bureau, and the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau. And more generally, I fully support our stalwart staff in the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau, who are responsible for faithfully executing this agency's emergency response and duties 24/7. Through actual storms or political maelstroms, your commitment and resolve never waver, and you remind me every day of what it means to serve and protect the American people. I'm grateful for all you do and look forward to continuing to work with you in the time to come. With that, we will proceed to a vote on the item. Commissioner O'Reilly?
Aye.
Commissioner Carr?
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel?
Dissent.
Commissioner Starks?
Dissent.
The chair votes to approve as well. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Would any colleagues like to make any announcements at this time? So I have, sorry, Starks, you're going back to tweeting.
You're stealing my...
I know, that's right. All right. Well, I do have a couple of announcements. First, and this one really hurts, Mike Mullenix from the International Bureau. I recently learned about this. I still haven't gotten over it, but Mike is departing these halls. And with the exception of a brief stint in the private sector, Mike has been with us for virtually his entire professional career, including when he was an engineer in training at the University of Maryland. I've had a chance to see Mike's work all in virtually every facet that IB is involved in, whether it's a series of detailed emails about the nuances of out-of-band protection limits in the 24 gigahertz band, or on the ground in Egypt, where I personally saw him doing 15-hour days, going up to all-nighters as the World Radio Communication Conference closed. And it is hard to describe unless you've been there and seen folks like this in action. Not only his work ethic and his stamina and his expertise, but his ability to distill very complex engineering topics into an explainable form, and a form that is persuasive to other people who may not share one's point of view. The diplomatic skill that he exhibited was so important to getting across the finish line forward-thinking views on spectrum policy. And Mike, I know I'm not doing justice to all that you've done, but just know that I and many others of this commission know the long hours that you put in to enable success of the World Radio Communication Conference and throughout all of the different spectrum issues that have fallen under IB's bailiwick. A grateful wireless nation turns its eyes to you and salutes you for the great work you've done. Bravo. Oh, sure.
I'd like to add my comments to the chairman's there. Mike and I have worked on a number of different projects, including 2 WARCs, CTEL, Plentypod, a couple of different things, and we've had many conversations in utmost respect for his work and representation of the American people internationally, and we'll look forward to working with him wherever he may go. So I thank the chair.
And wherever that is, hopefully that's a similarly short stint in the private sector, and we'll see you back here soon. On the other side of the ledger, we have an addition to the commission, specifically in our office. Miranda Isaacs is here, I believe. If you don't, unfortunately, the protocol is to stand up and be admired for your contributions to the office. She hails from Elizabethton, Tennessee, a small town in eastern Tennessee. She's a second-year law student at George Mason. Die-hard University of Tennessee fan, notwithstanding the Volunteers' difficulty on the football and basketball fields of late. Most impressively, she is a fan of Parks and Recreation, and I'm pleased to report thus far that her many contributions to the office have been more in the style of Leslie Knope as opposed to Jerry and some of the other characters on the show. So Miranda, we're so grateful that you're on the team and look forward to working with you for the rest of this semester. With that, Madam Secretary, I would ask you to announce the date of the next FCC open meeting.
The next agenda meeting of the Federal Communications Commission is Tuesday, March 31st, 2020.
And with that, we're adjourned.
Room ready for the press conference. For those of you who are still having conversations, if you wouldn't mind taking those outside, we're going to start Chairman Pai's press conference here momentarily. All right. So welcome to the press conference. The chairman's going to make an opening statement. We're happy to take some of your questions. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Chairman Pai.
Thank you, Ms. Pelkey. Since we last took part in this August ritual, the Kansas City Chiefs won their first Super Bowl in 50 years. And believe it or not, that was not my most memorable experience of the past month. And that is because earlier this week, I was honored to join the President and other senior U.S. government officials as part of a delegation that visited India. Throughout my life, I've traveled to the land of my ancestry on many occasions, and I've even visited my professional capacity as FCC chairman. But it was a special honor to represent the top levels of the U.S. government visiting the country where my parents grew up. When my mom and dad immigrated to America, I doubt they could have imagined that one day their son would go to the presidential palace, Rashtrapati Bhavan in New Delhi, and attend a state banquet with the Indian Prime Minister and the U.S. President as the highest-ranking Indian American official. I thought a lot about my family when the Prime Minister mentioned right after I met him, "We are very proud of you." And it reminded me of how much my parents and others have done for me and how amazing it was that all this transpired after just one generation. And I wish they could have been there to share in that moment. Damn it. Right. Okay. Anyway, on the work front, it was a hectic and productive 48 hours. I participated in bilateral meetings with my Indian counterparts at multiple agencies, including the Department of Telecommunications, the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India, and the National Security Council Secretariat's National Cybersecurity Coordinator. We got into the weeds on FCC initiatives ranging from our plans for the 6 gigahertz band to the Citizens Broadband Radio Service to our supply chain integrity measures and other topics. And the Prime Minister himself brought up 5G with me. Now, and as fate would have it, the FCC was poised to take a major step on this issue at today's meeting. Moments ago, the Commission majority voted to repurpose 280 megahertz of the C-band for flexible use and to launch a C-band auction on December 8th. This is the Commission's most significant action yet to repurpose mid-band airwaves for 5G. It'll quickly free up a significant amount of spectrum for next-generation wireless services. It'll generate significant revenue for the U.S. Treasury, and it will protect the services that are currently delivered using this spectrum. Now, while it may not have garnered as much attention as our C-band order, I'm really excited about today's vote to propose providing additional flexibility for white space device operations in the TV bands. This proposal would make it easier to harness the power of unused broadcast spectrum to expand Wi-Fi coverage in rural America. This plan has garnered broad and bipartisan support from elected officials, from consumer advocates, from innovators, and others. I hope the Commission will ride this wave of momentum and move quickly to adopt final rules that would help expand rural broadband connectivity. No doubt this has been a pretty exciting month for me, both personally and professionally. It's going to be hard to top it in the months ahead, but I look forward to trying. And with that, I would turn it over to our friends in the audience for any questions that you might have.
Chairman Matt Danneman with Communications Daily. Two-parter. First, where's my T-shirt from India? Secondly, the incentive payments for accelerated clearing, do you see that, at least conceptually, as a possible viable model for future band clearing approaches that the FCC does be for 5G or other uses? Is this something that the FCC is going to be looking at as a model to replicate going forward?
Well, I can't speak beyond the contours of the C-band proceeding itself, but what I will say is that applying the Emerging Technologies Framework and analyzing, as I mentioned, in coordination with economists, the extent to which wireless companies in a free market negotiation would be willing to pay a certain amount to solve the free rider and holdout problems, et cetera, directly with the satellite operators. We think that framework was a very useful one for analyzing how to quickly repurpose 280 megahertz of spectrum in the C-band. And whether it has application beyond this proceeding is yet we will have to see, but we're very confident in the framework we've adopted here, and not just as a legal matter, which I'd be happy to get into, of course, but also as a policy matter. To deliver the spectrum for 5G is a major step forward for American leadership, and I'm proud the FCC majority agreed to do that.
Howard.
Hi.
Mr. Chairman, I hope you start feeling better.
Oh, thanks. Me too.
I wanted to ask about, so there were a lot of comments about, you know, the litigation risk and how, and, you know, I think the conventional wisdom has been the more agreement there was on the C-band order, that sort of minimizes the litigation risk. And I know that you can overstate that, but just I wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Sure. I mean, I'm very confident in the legal authority that underpins this order, based in part on the able advice from our Office of General Counsel, bolstered by 2 former general counsels who serve in my office, as well as another former general counsel who serves as a commissioner. I think, along with my own meager legal skills, I feel confident that the sources of authority, part of which I identified in my statement, make it very clear that we have the authority to move forward. And moreover, as I mentioned, as a policy matter, it's imperative that we move forward. Waiting for Congress to act, I don't think is an option when American leadership and the need to repurpose spectrum for 5G is on the table.
Hi, Chairman. Kelsey Griffiths with Law 360. I was wondering if you could give us an update on where we're at in 6 gigahertz and maybe address whether you think we've learned some lessons in previous bands about sharing that are coming into play there.
So with respect to 6 gigahertz, we're continuing to sort through the record, of course, and work with some of the various stakeholders. I personally have spoken with both the advocates of unlicensed operations throughout the band. I've spoken to folks in the wireless industry who would like to segment the band, of course, and we've spoken with some folks representing the electric industry and others who want to make sure that incumbents are protected. And as I've made clear in my letters to Congress, for those congressmen and women and senators who've written on the issue, our goal here is pretty simple: to deliver value for American consumers using this public resource by protecting incumbents from harmful interference and by permitting unlicensed operations to enable the innovation of the future. And I'm confident that using the tools we have, using the expertise of the expert Office of Engineering and Technology staff, we'll be able to reach a happy medium.
Hi. With respect to last month's RDOF order, will you issue
Okay.
will you issue guidance to clarify the restrictions around carrier participation in areas that have already received state broadband subsidies, or do you expect to modify the order in any way?
In response to the petitions for reconsideration? Sorry, the question was, will we
Related to issuing guidance to clarify the restrictions on bidders in areas that have already received state subsidies.
Well, we did make that clarification in the order that was released, adopted and released last month.
And others are asking for expanded clarification?
If there are petitions for reconsideration or other vehicles for us providing that guidance, we'd be happy to take a look at it. But my understanding, based on the text that I recall reviewing after during the consideration of the item last month, is that we did make the necessary clarification. But we'd be happy to take another look at that.
Thank you.
Hi.
Chairman, Rachel Jewett with Thea Satellite. How concerned are you about the possibility of one of the satellite operators like Intelsat filing for bankruptcy and that affecting the clearing of the spectrum?
Well, I'm optimistic that the accelerated relocation payments that we discussed and adopted today will encourage satellite operators to clear the lower 300 megahertz of that C-band quickly. And the spectrum is going to be repurposed one way or the other. Either satellite operators can do so quickly and get the accelerated relocation payments, or they can do so more slowly and receive no such payments. The choice is obviously up to them, but we're confident that the framework that we have adopted will give them an incentive that aligns incentivizes them to work in coordination with the FCC in a way that's also is beneficial to them.
Hi, John Reed, Bloomberg Law. Does the FCC plan to propose fines against AT&T, Verizon, Sprint, and T-Mobile for improperly disclosing consumers' real-time location data?
Yes, and I believe I am authorized now that the items have been adopted to let you know that the fines for the respective carriers that we have proposed is more than $91 million for T-Mobile, more than $57 million for AT&T, more than $48 million for Verizon, and more than $12 million for Sprint. The total would be more than $200 million. The items will be released later today, I have been informed.
Hi, I'm Toby from Policy Tracker. Just to go back to the accelerated payments on the 3.7 to 4.2 gigahertz. So if the satellite operators do not accept the accelerated payments, then there's no chance this spectrum is going to be used for mobile until 2025. Is that something that you're comfortable with? And if they don't accept it, would you still try and find a way to have them accelerate, to clear out the band faster? I mean, some people have talked about having no incentive payments, for example. Thanks.
Again, I'm very optimistic that the framework we have adopted aligns the satellite operators' incentives with our own. In particular, the bifurcated track, if they make the election, i.e. accept the accelerated relocation payments, they will be able to receive $9.7 billion if all of them accept. Conversely, if they do not, if they do so more slowly and go with a slower track, they will not receive any payments. And so I'm confident that the emerging technologies-based framework we have adopted will encourage them to do that, to offer the quicker route.
And
Hey.
Chairman, just another question about the C-band and the $9.7 billion. The members of the C-band Alliance, or what used to be the C-band Alliance, whatever it counts as now, have been fighting over this $9.7 billion and have been saying that some want more, some should get less. Will the $9.7 billion still be split as it was originally conceived, with half to Intelsat and the other four splitting the remaining half?
You will have to wait for release of the item to see the precise allocation among the various companies that were detailed in the original order. And that item, as I understand it, was being prepared for release, but won't be released until early next week.
Hey there, Jonathan May, Communications Daily. We're just asking stakeholders about how, if at all, they're reacting to the coronavirus. So for the FCC, if there's been any internal guidance given, any change in travel plans, and also, any help to any administration efforts or not.
We do take this very seriously. It already has affected the travel plans of many at the Commission. For example, as you are probably aware, the Mobile World Congress in Barcelona was canceled, and we weren't able to attend that. And so going forward, what we have done is to look at our pandemic plan, and we are prepared to implement that plan if necessary.
Oh, thanks. On the proposed fines that you just confirmed that the Commission has voted to advance, can you talk about your thoughts about how you came to those numbers? And there's some critics on Capitol Hill that said the FCC had a statutory ability to impose far larger fines. And do you think this will be enough to deter the providers from this type of behavior in the future?
Well, look, we worked with the career staff of the Enforcement Bureau to adopt a framework for analyzing these issues. You'll have to wait for the release of the items to see precisely what that framework was. But again, we took decisive action to protect American consumers, and we are confident in the balance that we struck in this case.
Hi, Mr. Chairman. Todd Shields, Bloomberg News. Any change in the proposed split amongst in the accelerated payments in the C-band item for Intelsat and SES? Intelsat, under your proposal of February 7th, was to receive up to 50%. Any change proposed in that?
What I will say is that Intelsat made a number of constructive suggestions for edits to the order based on the release of the initial draft that we were able to incorporate into the final version. However, we did not believe that the record supported significantly increasing Intelsat's accelerated relocation payment. Okay. Thanks, everybody, and sorry for the sniffling and coughing and such.
All right, at this point, I'll invite Will Wyquist up for the Bureau press conference. Thanks, everyone.
Hello, folks. Do folks have questions on the C-band rules and the public notice? Okay. The Wireless Bureau and Economics and Analytics team here? I hope. WTB, OEA? Okay. Sorry, who had questions? Hey, Matt?
Matt Danneman, Communications Daily, or perhaps Julia. Can you give a little more granularity and a little more granularity and detail on how the disbursement of incentive payments between the draft item and the finalized item, how they changed, and also how, if there was, what change, if any, to the disbursement via Phase 1 versus Phase 2, the
I
proportions?
think the chairman answered that question adequately.
Nothing further?
Nope.
Okay, this is Howard Buskirk, also from Communications Daily, and I'm not going to ask the same question, but a variation thereof.
You can try for a third time.
I understand, stuff like that, like the financials part is very delicate, especially since there's a lot of people watching this, but are you able to say whether there were any other changes in the, not in the disbursement so much, but in terms of the transition stuff? We'd heard that there were going to be some other minor changes in the FCC's approach, and I'm asking that not direct, not directly respond, just anything else.
So there were some changes in terms of the deadlines, which I think were indicated in the press release that went out. There also were an unusually large number of submissions that were made after release of the public draft, and the draft that was adopted reflects or responds to those, but I'll let you wait until the order comes out to see what all those changes were, because there were significant.
You want us to have something to look forward to next week, right?
Right.
Okay, thank you.
So to go back to the financials, how late in the editing process was a decision made on the split between the accelerated payments? Considering that the commission has voted on it about 11:30 today, when was the decision made on X% goes to Intelsat and so on?
As a general matter, we don't get into that deliberative process details. The timing of when an edit was made. Any other questions on this item?
I don't know who exactly this was before, but how was 9.7 billion the figure that was determined? I believe in the report there's a mention of a discussion around 10.52 billion at some point. Where did that? How come it's not that number?
So to clarify, the 10.52 is the what OEA calculated as the total producer surplus created by the accelerated relocation. So that is what we deem to be the additional economic benefit of having the accelerated relocation, and at least to the licensees, to the overlay licensees. So a critical piece was to ensure that the payment, the accelerated relocation payment, was sufficiently below that we felt comfortable that the value generated through the acceleration was greater than the payment would be. So that's that 10.52 is what we estimated that value to be.
Thank you. Your name was? Sorry.
Julia McHenry, I'm chief of OEA.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions on this item or these items? All right, great. Thank you. And then some folks might need to be staying. I'm not sure if are there any questions on the 3.5 gigahertz auction public notice? Okay, and though you do? Okay. Sorry. I didn't know they were all the same. Are there? Sorry.
Okay, I just wanted to ask.
Sorry. One second. I guess should we also do the white spaces item on, is this the same group on the white spaces, or that's OET, right? Okay, sorry.
Oh, never mind, I don't have any questions. No, I'm just joking. This is just, this is just standard question. I'm not sure that there was a lot of details provided on like any changes, but we had heard that there were going to be a few, again, relatively minor changes over the draft. Anything more that you can tell us on that?
There were no significant changes to the draft between white copy and what was adopted today.
Thank you.
Anything else on this item? Okay, I think I mean it this time. Thank you. And any questions on the TV white spaces item? Okay. Any questions on the?
I'm sorry. Again, yeah. I'm sorry.
Okay. The Office of Engineering and Technology folks here. Howard?
Okay, this is going to seem boring, but I just wanted to ask, again, we'd heard that there were going to be a few tweaks, a few things around the edges. I wanted to ask, are there any changes that are noteworthy over the draft that you can discuss? And also, I think the Channel 37 issue came up during the comment, and does it get into the Channel 37 issue to any extent?
Okay, I'll address the second question first. No, it does not get into the Channel 37 question at all. That's outside of the scope of the NPRM. With respect to some of the tweaks, no substantial tweaks that you would be surprising. There was some ex parte filing on the antenna gain for the mobile devices. So we added a few questions in that portion of the item to take account of what came in after the public release of the document.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Any other questions on that item? Thank you. Are there any questions on the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund? Cool. The wireline, the OEA, and the Rural Broadband Auction Task Force folks here? Monica?
Hi, can you please give a little bit more detail on how the language was softened to make the item maybe more technology neutral?
Well, we made some adjustments to deal with an ex parte that came in from SpaceX. So we are trying to not necessarily consider SpaceX's satellite technology as the same as other satellite technologies.
Because it's low Earth as opposed to?
Correct.
Thank you. I'm sorry, any other substantive changes to the, from the draft? No. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions on the Media Bureau item? Okay, and any questions on the public safety information sharing item? All right, thank you, and I think the commissioners are here. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Can we answer any questions you may have?
Commissioners, I guess, try you as well. Can you give any kind of detail on the $64,000 money question regarding the C-band accelerated payment disbursement?
$64,000 question. This would have been easy. We would have solved this one.
Yeah, the metaphorical $64,000.
I'm sorry.
Less than a rounding error.
What's the question?
I
missed
between
your
the
earlier.
draft and the finalized order, what kind of changes were made?
I think they're mostly technical and don't do dramatic change to the item. I think it was a fine item when it came out and a fine item now. I don't think there's the differences between the two are that significant.
So nothing significant, nothing notable in terms of who gets paid what?
I think that the changes are well, you should see the document, but I don't think they're that substantially changed.
If you want to give me your copy, I'll.
It will come out momentarily.
Early next week, I'm told. I think that's what the chairman said.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, I had two questions, one on 6 gigahertz, which somebody else had asked the chairman about earlier. I wanted to ask specifically, so there's been a lot of push lately, I won't mention any names of any major trade associations, but in the area of, the FCC should look at moving some of the 6 gigahertz folks to higher spectrum and, and then license part of the band rather than it all being unlicensed. Is it your sense that that's an alive issue, or has the ship sort of sailed on that one already?
Well, look, I've said I'll keep an open mind on the issue, exploring the proposal that they have put forward. I do think it's late in the game to make some of these suggestions, and I'm not sure all the components that they speak of are actually viable. So I'm continuing to keep an open mind, but I find that some of it is problematic at the current time, and we'll just see if that changes in the coming months.
Sure, Mr. Carr.
Obviously, we'll make the decision based on where the record is when the chairman circulates, but one broader policy perspective that I bring to the 6 gigahertz proceeding is looking to get a significant win for unlicensed spectrum there. We've had some really good wins across the board, whether it's today in C-band, and a lot of licensed spectrum in the mid-band range that's been out there. And I think when you step back from that and you think about the 5G ecosystem at large, I think it would benefit from a significant number of large unlicensed channels in 6. I think that's going to drive a lot of the use cases that are going to benefit licensed 5G interests. So I think getting all that spectrum out there as much as we can, given where the record is, to enable unlicensed use cases is going to be a big win, not just for people that traditionally like unlicensed spectrum, but for everyone that has an interest in U.S. leadership in 5G and driving use cases forward.
Okay, and then I also wanted to ask about Legato. I understand that the chairman controls the agenda, but Legato has said recently that they have more time, they have more time before they have to file for bankruptcy, which would mean that the FCC could act potentially, before close to the end of the year. do you favor doing something more in legato? Because I mean, that's more spectrum, another spectrum band in mid-band that potentially could be used for 5G.
I'm open to considering what's presented and wait for the chairman and what direction he may have on the item. I have mentioned many times on this topic that I haven't delved in. I didn't have the time to take the lead on the issue years ago, and I haven't since. So I wait for someone to provide a recommendation, and I'll look forward to reading it at the time. But I'll go back to your 6 gigahertz point, which I'm sure we'll get the question on the timing. I've been working to secure those commitments on the timing, and I hope to have that item in the very near future. I don't want to get ahead of the chairman, but I think we're going to see it in the very near future. It's incredibly important that we unleash and provide more unlicensed spectrum. This is is part and parcel of one of my 4 points as it relates to the C-band. I would like to have done them at the same time. We're obviously missing that boat a little bit, but I don't think it's going to be a tremendous difference in timing. So I'm really excited on what can be possible in the unlicensed space and what will be available coming forward.
And Commissioner Carr, you'd seemed a little somewhat optimistic about the legato stuff at one point. When you guys voted on the auction rules, but I'm just wondering if you have any sense on any.
Yeah, back when we voted to move that item forward, I spoke positively about the hopes that I could have for moving forward with L-band, but there's no update from my perspective on where we are. Hopefully we'll move forward and give people a decision that they're due one way or the other. And I think there's still some more technical work to be done, but I look forward to reaching a decision on that one.
Thank you both.
Yeah.
Hi, Commissioners. I just wanted to see if both of you have any comments about the results of the mobile tracking investigation. I know this is something that the minority has been a lot more vocal about, and now that you all are able to speak about it, what are your thoughts about the way the FCC handled this?
Well, I don't know how much we're able to speak about it. I saw the chairman's comments. The items haven't actually been released. It has actually been released?
Absolutely.
Oh, okay.
Or at least the announcement of the item.
Yes. The announcement of the item, the documents themselves, so you get a chance to read them. I have a statement that's going, that we attach to them. I think that reflects my views. I have some deep concerns about the investigations, the fulsomness of what has been explored, both in terms of our authority and a bunch of different things. So I look forward to, I think there's enough material to go for an NAL stage, but after that, I think we've got some serious work to do.
Yeah, I don't think the text of the item has been released yet. So I want to wait for the text of it to get out there before speaking more on the merits of it.
Okay, thanks.
Hi, do you support opening a comments period on U.S. contribution reform to refresh the record and see what some of the stakeholder ideas are that could add revenue to the contribution base?
I'm open to ideas on how to reform, contribution reform. New ideas haven't been presented in quite a while. I don't know that pushing out a new item is the appropriate way to get any action on this item, so I'm not going to commit to something like that at this time.
What are some of the other ways you'd like to hear the ideas?
I've challenged the state participants to come forward with different ideas that aren't the same exact ideas that they proposed many years ago. They haven't seemed to have moved off that dime.
Could I ask one more? The U.S. Appeals Court they remanded 3 issues on the net neutrality rule. Are you hopeful about the comments that might come in, and is there any one item that you're most interested in seeing changed?
No, I look forward to the record that's presented. Hopefully the comments will be substantive versus the past experience with some of the comments on net neutrality that had very little value at all. So hopefully they'll be addressing the issues that the court has raised. I think they're all answerable and will be consistent with the outcome that we came up with, and satisfy the court's concerns if any.
Do you have anything?
Hi, I'm sorry to bring politics into this, but as political officers, do you worry about the daylight between the FCC and Senator Kennedy on the accelerated payments?
Well, I've only seen a couple comments from him. I will defer to the legislative branch at any time, and I've said that my entire career. If they pass a statute, I will honor it, whether I agree or disagree with it. I appreciate that I think there's universal agreement there has to be some type of incentive payment. And now we're just having a disagreement over what the potential number may be, and we'll just have to see how it plays out. I think that the landing spot that the chairman found is sufficient to address the different sides, and I appreciate that. And if anyone wants to change that number, I'd want to see how it influenced and impacted the discussion amongst the different participants for this very delicate issue.
Hey, Commissioners, so one company, or potentially three, has already threatened litigation over this announcement. ABS Global, formerly Asia Broadcast Satellite, had worked together with Hispasat and Embratel Star One on trying to get compensation for their partial coverage of the U.S. Are you concerned that this and others will present a significant legal challenge that may obviate this? You're trying to save 2 years. May not be possible if everybody fights over it and drags it through courts.
I would answer in this way, that I think that the document presented answers many of these issues sufficiently, and hopefully the courts will agree with our position going forward. Litigation is always a risk in our business, and especially on the high-profile items, and we'll just have to see what is challenged and how. There's lots of people who make assertions they may or may not challenge, and we'll just have to see what comes forward and be able to defend our cases if need be. I think we have strong arguments to make, and we'll just and a strong team to make them, and we'll just have to see if it comes to that.
I'm very confident in where we landed in terms of our legal authority, and I'm confident as well that at the end of the day, the incumbent satellite providers are going to reach a decision that makes business sense for them. Again, if you step back, some of the largest, if not the largest, incumbent satellite providers here have businesses in which they are losing money, they are heavily indebted, and to accelerate the clearing of spectrum based on our public interest considerations, we've been able to identify $9.7 billion. And I think that's not just something that makes sense from our record and our perspective. At the end of the day, I think that's going to make a lot of sense for the satellite companies as well. I like to think of this a little bit as an analogy. I grew up not too far from here in Virginia, and there was this farm called Cox's Farm. I'm not endorsing it because that might be like some sort of weird Hatch Act violation or something. But they pitched themselves as having the world's greatest hayride. And now I take my kids there. And you get about halfway through this hayride, and you come to a fork in the road. And there's a sign. And the sign points one direction, and it says, the easy way. There's a sign that points the other way that says the hard way. And the guy driving the tractor always turns around and asks the kids, which way do you want to go? Before you get to the intersection, the kids always yell, hard way, hard way, hard way. So, of course, the tractor invariably goes that way. In fact, I've never heard someone ask to go the easy way. I'm not even sure what is down that path. That is a long-winded way of saying that I'm comfortable at this point, no matter which way we end up going. But I do think the landing spot that we've had makes the right decision for the incumbent providers very clear in my mind. I'm confident they're going to reach the right decision, but I'm confident either way that we're going to clear this spectrum up in a timely manner, and it's going to be another good win for U.S. leadership in 5G.
Hey, gentlemen, Jonathan Make, Communications Daily. I just wanted to follow up on Kelsey's question, and I had one more, and these are both for both of you, please. Commissioner O'Reilly, I'm sensing that you voted against the NAL. Could basically both of you just please share what your votes are on that, and then I'll get to my follow-up.
I supported the 4 different items as it relates to the NALs on the wireless location tracking issue you mentioned.
I cast my vote in favor.
Okay, 2 yes votes. And then something we're asking a number of stakeholders, which is how they personally are reacting in their official capacities to the coronavirus. So for both of you, if you're able to comment on whether it's affected you or your office's travel looking ahead, if you have seen the FCC's pandemic plan that Chairman Pai mentioned is ready if it needs to be used, and if you see any role for the FCC in assisting the federal government at this time in any way. Thanks.
It hasn't impacted my my travel for work at all, and we at the FCC stand ready to assist in the federal government's response. I think you mentioned the chairman talking about the work he's doing, the work he's going to do. The chairman's office obviously is the principal place where we liaison with a lot of federal counterparts on these types of issues. And so we all, I can speak for myself, and I'm sure for all my colleagues, we're ready to do our part to make sure we have an appropriate, effective response.
Well, I think you saw, it has disrupted already. I mean, as the chairman indicated, none of us went to Barcelona. That was disappointing. It's one of my favorite shows of the year. And I'm also mindful of upcoming events and travel. But at the current time, I'm looking, and following information as presented by the federal government, and we'll make, hopefully things will not cause any disruption going forward. So I'm mindful of it as both a government official and a parent, but I'm just keeping up to speed as best I can.
Thank you both.
Well,
Go ahead.
All right, okay.
Over there.
We'll go over there and we'll come back.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner, just following up on your comment about we haven't seen the NALs yet, but it sounds like what you're saying is are you concerned about the methodology, how the fines were calculated, or whether the carriers are being unfairly held to account for what other contractual companies are doing with it?
I'd have to defer to my statement on this matter because it's both the criticism or critique of the investigation itself and then also the calculation of the fines, I think are both, they're sufficient for purposes of NAL, and we'll go with that.
Commissioner Carr, do you share any concerns about how the fines are calculated or the investigation?
At this point, I just want to let the NALs get out there. Obviously, they're important documents to you all, and let's let people digest that, and then happy to communicate after folks have a chance to review it.
Hi, gentlemen. Todd Shields, Bloomberg. I'm sorry if this was asked and answered. I was deep in a different story a moment ago. But regarding the payments to Intelsat and SES, Mr. Pai said the case hasn't been made for a significant increase. Has there been some increase? What can you tell me about the payments, the accelerated relocation payments for the
Did you
companies?
hear my Cox's Farm thing?
Yeah, no, missed that.
Replay that.
Easy way, hard way? Yeah, I caught that.
I'm not sure what that meant. I'm gonna
Yeah,
go
me
back and
either.
listen to that one
Me
because
either.
I don't know what the
Let's
hell
do it
the
the easy
analogy
way.
was
Let's
there.
do it the easy way. Just give me figures.
Yeah, to be honest with you, you should look at the document itself, which will come out momentarily. It
Okay.
sounds like it's going to be early next week. I don't think there were substantial changes, and there may have been some around the edges, but not to the degree that some had sought. I'd say it that way.
Okay.
Any other questions before lunch for us? Can we answer anything? John, Donnelly? Nope. All right. Well, everyone have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, everyone, I think it might just be me today. Much like the chairman, I'm also a little stuffy. Go ahead.
Commissioner Matt Daneman, Communications Daily. Both you and Commissioner Rosenworcel had brought up on the Media Bureau item, on the cable file item, the notion of that there should be a revisiting of the underlying remand before this. Do you have any kind of sense as to whether anything like that is underway or being discussed at Media Bureau or on the 8th floor?
Yeah, it's a process point that we should revisit the underlying statute before we just take a whack at what is a reporting requirement that we're pulling down. I don't believe that there's any visiting of the underlying statute at this point.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, Howard Busker, Communications
Hey, Howard.
Daily. So you mentioned, I think you were the most explicit of all the commissioners talking about your concerns about the litigation risk from the C-band order. I guess you already said a lot, but I just wanted to just circle back and ask you, how big of sort of existential risk do you see that litigation is posing to anything like a sort of speedy C-band auction?
Yeah, I mean, it gets into the trade-off, obviously of speed versus doing it the right way. And as I very clearly said, in my statement, I think, mandatory, accelerated, incentivized, payments that aren't tethered to actual relocation costs, I think, is a real legal risk under 309J. Whether any of the parties decide that they're going to want to actually litigate is obviously something that we'll have to see how it plays out. We heard already over the last week to 10 days or so that the marriage between Intelsat and SES had dissolved. Parties there were at least saber-rattling that they were going to litigate. So if that does in fact come to pass, that is going to, if the bargain that was struck even today fails because you have parties sue, then I really think we're in an even worse situation.
So, but I guess that then the question becomes, what should the chairman have done? Because I mean, that's part of the problem sometimes when you're the party who's, it's like these things are quite kind of hard to get done. So I guess, was there another solution that the FCC could have implemented?
I think having Congress weigh in, certainly Congress can help obviate any litigation risk. Congress can, of course, also appropriate those dollars for rural broadband, for next-gen 911, things that are really cared about. We decided to proceed today despite the fact that there are negotiations, what I understand are close negotiations going on the House, on the Senate, on how to proceed. And then the other way is obviously what I think would be a much more well-established route to go, where you did not have mandatory payments, but rather voluntary payments that would be following our past precedent here.
Thank you.
Yep.
Hi, Commissioner Starks.
Hey.
Kelsey Griffiths with Law 360.
Yeah.
We've obviously seen a lot of activity surrounding election security and a lot of talk about election security in the last few weeks. So I just wanted to check in with you and see if you have any updates on your wireless election security initiative or anything you wanted to say after Iowa.
Yes, I mean, obviously Iowa was, issues where we're starting to see, applications that are based upon phone voting and wireless issues. I do have concerns with that. What I have talked about obviously previously as well is that where those were in caucuses, but where you had an actual election machine that is connected to cellular modems, that presents a real election security issue. So this is something that I am going to continue to focus on. Obviously, we are hurtling through our election season right now. I think this has got to be a real focus to make sure that every vote is counted in the right way here in 2020.
Thank you.
Hi, do you have any update on the investigation into possible wrongdoing by Sprint and its Lifeline subscriber?
So I myself would not have any knowledge. Obviously, I have previously said that, where you're talking about, going on memory, I think it was 800,000 Lifeline subscribers that were improperly accounted for there, based upon prior precedent. That would make this, the largest Lifeline investigation right now is about a $33 million case. And that was just a number of thousands of improper subscribers there for Lifeline. Here you're talking about 800,000. And so this is something that Sprint is going to have to be held accountable for. I'm hoping that that investigation is proceeding as quickly as possible. Obviously, it was something that I said should have been dealt with before the merger was allowed to close.
And is it clear that T-Mobile would inherit that liability?
Who actually inherits that liability is probably a legal question. You know, whether it's retained by Sprint or the new T-Mobile is something that we probably have to look at closely with the merger contracts at issue itself. That's not something that whether Sprint pays or T-Mobile pays, what I'm really focused on is making Americans whole, making the fund whole. As I said, you know, when you're talking about enforcement actions, there's the first most immediate step is clawback. So any federal dollars, any U.S. dollars that were improperly paid, we should claw all that money back, all of it, which in this case would be, you know, millions of dollars. And then you get into the penalty phase, which is what is going to be through a consent decree or an NAL, which is actually penalizing Sprint for their improper behavior.
Commissioner Rachel Jewett from Via Satellite, you just said that you would favor voluntary payments instead of mandatory relocation payments. I'm just curious, hypothetically, what would that mean?
Well, that's the way our past precedent has worked. Instead of mandatorily saying that you have to pay these incentive payments, they are voluntarily negotiated between the parties.
Hi, Mr. Starks, Todd Shields with Bloomberg News. Did Intelsat's payment go up or down in the final order compared with the February 7th?
You know, I think we'll have to look at the actual order and see exactly what shakes out. You know, I think that is, all of that has been focused on kind of a swirl that has happened as the alliance kind of broke down there, and they started trying to cut up that amount of money themselves. So I think we'll see where it finally shakes out in the final order.
Thank you.
Yep.
Hi, Commissioner Toby from Policy Tracker. Just to clarify your point of view on the accelerated payments, is your position to it based on the fact that there shouldn't be a big accelerated payments, or just that that particular number isn't backed up by all the analysis and you know, something from Congress and all that?
Well, you know, I think Congress could have, Congress obviously can figure out how much money should be in part of the incentive payments package. Under the current law, under our current precedent, having mandatory accelerated relocation payments that is not tied to the actual costs is unlawful.
And do you think that's correct? Do you think it should be like that on a policy kind of level?
Well, I mean, the normative policy, you know, I'm bound by our prior precedent and what the courts have signed off on.
Commissioner, Eutelsat was also seeking an increase in their potential allocation of the accelerated clearing payments. I think they were trying to triple what they could get from a little under 500 million to 1.5 billion. Have they gotten any closer? Was there any change on that front?
Yeah, I mean, all of these are good questions. You know, how the actual final cuts, you know, obviously the parties are interested. You all are interested. I think we'll have to see how all that shakes out in the final order, how the pie got cut.
And when will that final order be?
Yeah, ask the chairman's office. They're the ones that kind of control release of those documents, yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, Jonathan Make, Communications Daily. We're just asking stakeholders about how they professionally are reacting to the coronavirus. So if you have any thoughts on anything additional the FCC can be doing and whether it's affected you or your office's travel yet going forward. And then I don't think it was asked yet, just a question about you weighing in on the carrier proposed fines and your support or not for those. Thanks.
Yes. So on the first, you know, you know, as the chairman said, Mobile World Congress obviously getting pulled down from Barcelona. I was expected to go to that. I was planning to go to that, and that was pulled down. So that has affected my office a little bit. But more broadly, I think it's a really good question. You know, and I think there are obviously part of getting broadband more ubiquitous plays into this. You may have people that need to have kids stay at home, schools may be closed, people who need to work from home. So there is a broadband access element here. But there's a public security, public safety, really a 911 issue here, where you may have a lot of Americans that are calling that are confused. I think I would probably say that we need to convene our 911 community and dispatchers and PSAPs to make sure that they have a full understanding of how we can approach keeping people safe, keeping people secure, keeping people healthy. There's a lot of folks that may start to worry about that. I'd be, obviously, just in my commissioner's office, it might be hard for me to come up with that convening. I certainly would be eager to work with the chairman on it. But there's a real, probably a 911 public safety element to this that does need to be thought through, and making sure that we're helping with our communications piece on keeping people safe. On the location, the item has been released, so I'm free to talk about it. I approved in part because I think that customer location misuse by these 4 carriers and holding them accountable under Section 222 is big. That is important. In the rest of the item, I objected and dissented. And here's why, is that if you take a step back and really look at our theory of harm, we said that if the carriers, the number of contractual, the number of contracts that a carrier has with location aggregators or with data location services providers is what is, the number of contracts at issue is basically how we base our base forfeiture. And so it's kind of a top-down way of looking at liability. How many contracts were at issue? I disagree with that fundamentally, categorically. I think this is a consumer harm issue. You're talking about more than almost any other type of case. This was an individualized harm where people had their personal location and privacy misused and abused. And so we should have had a consumer-based remedy here. And so what would that look like? It would actually us investigating in a way that would have subpoenaed. This is knowable, how many consumers actually had their geolocation information abused, misused, sold in improper ways. But we didn't investigate that way, and so I object. And really, to come back, the last thing, or 2 more things that I'd say, is when you're talking about this contract-based liability, what actually happens is you may have a carrier that has significantly more millions of consumers that probably had their location information abused, but maybe they have less contracts than another carrier. And so when you're looking at the whole landscape of the 4, I think that this was a poor proxy to get at what is a consumer-based harm. The last thing that I'd say here, quite truthfully, is that in my prior government service, I was a prosecutor, and I think I've said this before, where I've stood up in court and actually protected victims and said that we need a court order to protect this victim from somebody who's trying to harm them. And so I feel strongly about that. Here, in particular, I spoke with one of the victims that we've identified, and that is Missouri State Highway Patrol Master Sergeant Bud Cooper. I was able to make contact with him and have a good, at-length conversation with him. And as you would expect, even as a law enforcement official, he felt that he had been violated. He literally told me, I felt violated. I was angry at having my privacy. It felt like somebody had entered my home. That's how he felt that he had been abused in that way. And so I feel strongly that that has to be part of the story. And that's part of the consumer harm here.
And is that to say, too, that you feel the proposed financial penalty should have been higher?
That is to say that I think that we went at this case and this investigation in such a way. I completely reject the framework that we've taken. We have taken a contract-based theory of harm, and I reject that. I'm, like any person in law and policy, I'm not going to even adhere to that framework. I think we should have we should have issued subpoenas. We should have issued subpoenas to parties that would have helped us get to how many consumers had their location information harmed, and that should have driven and generated our liability and our forfeiture number.
Thanks.
Yep. Anybody else? All right, Joe. Thank you.
Thank you.